My name is Natalie, and I'm 34 years old. For the last 10 years, I've spent my career hunting criminals on behalf of the United States Army. I genuinely believed I had already witnessed the very worst that humanity had to offer during my deployments overseas. Nothing, however, could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me on my own front porch during a freezing, rain-drenched November night. Huddled together beneath the weak glow of the porch light was my younger sister Sophie, clutching her 4-year-old daughter Zoe tightly against her chest. They were both shivering uncontrollably, soaked straight through to the bone, with nothing to their name but a single garbage bag stuffed full of clothes sitting beside them on the wet concrete. Through chattering teeth, Sophie lifted her gaze to meet mine, her eyes utterly hollow and lifeless, and whispered that her husband had just brought his mistress into their home. Worse still, his own mother had helped pack up their belongings before locking them outside in the middle of the storm. I didn't offer her a hug. I didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. I simply reached over, unlocked my truck door, and said 4 words. "Get in now. It's my turn." Before I continue telling you this story, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to become the shield protecting someone you love, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me on this one. What happens next is absolutely worth sticking around for. I didn't drive us to a hotel that night. I didn't stop at some roadside diner for hot cocoa to warm everyone up. Instead, I threw my truck into reverse and sped directly back toward the upscale suburban neighborhood that Dion had always been so obsessed with. The entire drive was suffocated by a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of little Zoe crying for her favorite blanket, the one she'd been forced to leave behind. My knuckles turned white from how tightly I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing back to memories of the bright, ambitious college student my sister used to be, long before Dion had systematically cut her off from everyone who ever loved her. My combat boots struck the wet pavement with a heavy, deliberate thud as I marched straight up the paved walkway leading to their pristine 4-bedroom colonial house. Sophie trailed close behind me, begging and pleading for me to just let it go, absolutely terrified of causing a scene that might upset her husband. That single detail alone spoke volumes about the depth of his psychological grip on her. She had just been thrown out into the freezing cold like a piece of unwanted trash, and yet, there she was, still desperately worried about protecting his precious reputation in front of the homeowners association. I ignored her frantic pleas entirely. I didn't bother knocking. I didn't bother ringing the smart doorbell mounted beside the frame. Instead, I planted my boot squarely below the deadbolt and kicked the heavy mahogany front door open, with enough raw force to splinter the door frame and send the lock flying clean across the entryway. The scene that greeted me inside the living room made the blood in my veins run absolutely ice cold. A fire roared cheerfully inside the stone fireplace. Dion lounged comfortably across the expensive leather sofa, swirling a glass of pricey champagne between his fingers. Beside him sat Ashley, a 27-year-old woman wearing my sister's custom silk bathrobe like it belonged to her. In the armchair opposite them sat Brenda, Dion's mother, laughing loudly at whatever remark Ashley had just made. That laughter died instantly the moment the heavy door slammed against the entryway wall. Dion shot to his feet, spilling champagne all over the imported Persian rug he was normally so paranoid about keeping spotless. He puffed his chest out, desperately trying to maintain the arrogant, successful businessman facade he loved projecting to his country club friends. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Dion shouted at me, stepping forward with his fists balled tight. He glanced over toward Sophie, who was cowering slightly behind my shoulder, and his expression twisted into an ugly, contemptuous sneer. "I told you we're done, Sophie. You're a leech. You haven't worked a single day in 5 years. You sit around spending my hard-earned money, contributing absolutely nothing to this household except your constant whining. My mother was right about you from day one. You're nothing but dead weight." Brenda rose from her seat, smoothing down her designer slacks with an air of practiced elegance. She looked at Sophie with pure, undisguised disgust, completely ignoring her freezing, crying 4-year-old granddaughter standing right there in front of her. Dion is a successful, highly educated black man who deserves a woman on his level, Brenda declared proudly, gesturing toward her son as though he were royalty holding court in his own palace. We rescued you, Sophie. We brought you into a respectable family, and all you did was drag him down with your laziness and those pathetic panic attacks of yours. You never once appreciated the lifestyle he gave you. Now take your brat and get out before I call the neighborhood watch. You never belonged here, and you never will. Ashley merely smirked from her spot on the couch, crossing her legs and casually adjusting the collar of the robe, the exact same robe Sophie had received as a Mother's Day gift just 6 months earlier. Ashley looked me up and down, clearly unimpressed by my soaked combat uniform, blissfully unaware of exactly who she was actually dealing with. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, acting as though she'd just won herself the ultimate prize. I stepped fully into the light, letting the rainwater drip steadily off my uniform onto the pristine hardwood floor beneath me. I looked directly at Ashley, and my voice dropped into a dangerously calm whisper. If you don't want to be arrested for receiving stolen property, I suggest you take my sister's robe off right now. Ashley gasped audibly, her smirk vanishing instantly. She turned to Dion, practically demanding he do something about the lunatic ruining their little celebration. Dion pulled his expensive smartphone from his pocket. His hands trembled ever so slightly from the sudden shift in energy in the room, though his voice still dripped with false bravado. You have exactly 10 seconds to get out of my house before I call the police, Dion threatened, already dialing on the keypad. You think you can just break in here and threaten my guests because you're wearing a uniform? I pay the bills here, I pay the mortgage, this is my property, and you're going to jail. I reached inside my tactical vest, completely ignoring his rant. I pulled out a folded waterproof document sleeve and tossed it down onto the glass coffee table, right beside their champagne flutes. Call them, I said, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with the man who had just destroyed my sister's entire life. I want you to call them right now. I want to watch the exact look on their faces, and on yours, when the officers read that property deed. Because while you were so busy playing the rich, powerful man of the house, isolating my sister and feeding your massive ego, you conveniently forgot one tiny legal detail. This 4-bedroom estate was purchased entirely through my Veterans Affairs loan while I was overseas on deployment. Your name isn't on that deed, Dion. Mine is. You're trespassing in my home. For one brief, suspended moment, the room fell so silent I could hear the freezing rain lashing against the shattered mahogany door. Then Dion threw his head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh. He genuinely believed I was bluffing. Or worse, he believed his own delusions of grandeur so deeply that he'd convinced himself legal paperwork simply didn't apply to him because he was, in his mind, the undisputed man of the house. He looked at me with pure condescension, shaking his head as though he were dealing with a stubborn, unruly child who couldn't grasp how the real world actually worked. You think a piece of paper means anything when I'm the one paying the utility bills? Dion sneered, pulling his phone back up to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, calculating glare. Yes, operator. I need police at my residence immediately. A violent military veteran just kicked my front door off its hinges. She's having some kind of severe PTSD episode, and she's physically threatening my family. Please hurry. She looks completely unhinged and armed. He ended the call and slipped the phone smoothly back into his pocket, flashing a triumphant smile toward Ashley, who had visibly relaxed back into the leather sofa. See, Ashley, Dion said smoothly, deliberately projecting his voice so we could all hear him clearly. This is exactly why I told you we had to get Sophie out of our lives. Her whole family is mentally unstable. We can't have this kind of erratic energy anywhere near my business." Within minutes, the red and blue flashing lights of two patrol cars painted the living room walls, reflecting sharply off the expensive crystal glasses scattered across the table. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wet concrete walkway, and two local police officers entered the house, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They took one look at the splintered doorframe, at my soaked combat uniform, and at the terrified 4-year-old girl clinging desperately to her weeping mother, and they immediately tensed up. Before either officer could ask a single question, Brenda launched into what could only be described as an Oscar-worthy performance. She threw both hands to her chest, her face contorting into an exaggerated mask of absolute terror, and rushed toward the officers as though she were a frightened victim fleeing for her life. "Oh, thank God you're here!" Brenda cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly practiced fear. "Officers, this woman just broke into our home like some kind of wild animal. My son is a successful, law-abiding black man. He's a pillar of this community, a respected corporate executive, and we were sitting here peacefully when this soldier barges in making violent threats. My daughter-in-law has always created a highly toxic environment, but bringing her deranged sister here to physically attack us, we are genuinely fearing for our lives right now." Brenda used every modern therapy buzzword she could possibly think of, weaponizing the very language of victimhood to protect her abusive son. She claimed Sophie was projecting her own insecurities, that she lacked healthy boundaries, and that bringing me into the home was nothing more than an act of aggressive retaliation. The officers absorbed her narrative almost instantly. They looked over at Dion, who stood tall and composed, the very picture of a calm professional. Then they looked at me, dripping wet, dressed in military camouflage, standing directly beside a shattered door. That was the exact moment Sophie finally broke. The sheer audacity of the gaslighting she was witnessing shattered whatever fragile composure she had left. She clutched Zoe tightly against her chest and began hyperventilating, her voice rising into a frantic, broken scream. "He's lying!" Sophie shrieked, tears streaming freely down her face as she pointed a shaking finger directly at her husband. "He's lying about everything. He locked me outside in the freezing rain so he could bring his mistress in. He took my phone away so I couldn't call for help. He hasn't let me speak to my friends in 3 years. He monitors my location every single day. He gives me $50 a week for groceries and screams at me if I buy the wrong brand of milk. He is destroying me." Instead of recognizing the textbook signs of severe coercive control and financial abuse standing right in front of them, the officers simply saw a hysterical, disheveled woman screaming at a calm, wealthy man. The bias was instantaneous. One officer sighed heavily, completely dismissing my sister's panic attack, and turned his full attention toward me instead. He took a slow, calculated step forward, his hand hovering dangerously close to his radio. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands exactly where I can see them," the officer commanded, his tone dripping with authority. "Are you currently suffering from some kind of mental health crisis? We can get you help, but you cannot come into this neighborhood kicking down doors and terrorizing homeowners." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I knew exactly how this particular game was played. I slowly raised my empty hands, keeping every movement deliberate, steady, and entirely predictable. "I'm not having an episode, officer," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I am an active duty officer with the United States Army, and I am currently removing unwanted trespassers from my private property." I gestured with my chin toward the coffee table. "I'd suggest you take a look at the waterproof folder sitting right there next to that bottle of champagne. That is the official deed to this property, recorded with the county clerk. This house was purchased entirely with my Veterans Affairs loan. The mortgage is in my name. The man you're currently protecting is nothing more than a guest who just illegally evicted my sister and my niece into a freezing rainstorm. I simply return the favor." The second officer stepped forward, picked the folder up off the table, and opened it. His eyes scanned the heavy, watermarked paper carefully. He looked at the name printed on the document, then glanced up at my military identification card, which I had slowly pulled from my tactical vest. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The officers realized all at once that they had stumbled directly into a massive civil dispute, and, more importantly, that Dion had flat out lied to them about who actually owned the home. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a slight nod of grudging respect. "Sir," the officer said, turning toward Dion with a suddenly hardened expression. "This is her property. We cannot remove her, and we cannot force her to let you stay here. This is a civil matter. If she wants you out, you need to leave." Brenda gasped, her face going slack as though she'd just been slapped. Ashley immediately stood up, visibly nervous, pulling her coat tightly over my sister's silk robe, clearly realizing she was now caught in the crossfire of a genuine war zone. But Dion didn't panic. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his designer shirt and let out a low, dark chuckle. He walked right up to me, his eyes burning with pure malice. "You think you won because of a piece of paper?" Dion sneered, leaning in close so only I could hear him. "Enjoy the house tonight, Natalie. Sleep tight, because I'll have an emergency restraining order against both of you by 8 a.m., and I'll make absolutely sure the judge knows exactly how unstable my wife really is." Dion made good on that threat. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, a sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the still quiet house. I opened the heavy front door to find a man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick stack of legal documents. He asked to confirm my name and my sister's name, shoved the papers into my chest, and walked away toward his idling sedan without saying another word. I looked down at the bold black letters printed across the top of the first page. It was a temporary restraining order, but the second document was the one that made my blood run genuinely cold. It was an ex parte emergency custody order. Dion had gone before a judge in the middle of the night, spun a masterful web of lies about my military background and my sister's mental health, and successfully convinced the court that 4-year-old Zoe was in immediate, life-threatening danger. The order was legally binding, and it mandated that Sophie surrender custody of her daughter to Dion's designated guardian immediately. Before I could even finish processing the legal jargon, a black luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. Brenda stepped out, flanked by 2 new police officers who were clearly there specifically to enforce the court order. She wore a perfectly tailored designer trench coat, carried a pink overnight bag, and wore a smile so incredibly smug it made my hands curl instinctively into tight fists. She marched up the walkway as though she were strolling down a red carpet to accept some kind of award. Sophie came downstairs holding Zoe against her hip, her eyes red and swollen from crying all through the night. The moment she saw the police officers standing in the foyer alongside Brenda, every last drop of color drained from her face. She took an involuntary step backward, clutching her daughter even tighter against her chest. "Hand her over, Sophie," Brenda commanded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she held out her perfectly manicured hands. "The judge read all about your little episodes. Dion submitted your entire medical file this morning. The court completely agrees that a woman suffering from severe, untreated postpartum depression and manic anxiety is entirely unfit to raise a child. We're taking Zoe to a stable, loving environment where she won't be subjected to your toxic, unstable behavior. She'll be so much happier living with Dion and Ashley anyway." Ashley already bought her a brand new bedroom set. Sophie let out a guttural, heartbroken sob and stumbled back another step, shielding Zoe with her own body as though Brenda were wielding an actual weapon. "You have no right!" Sophie cried out, her voice cracking with pure desperation as the officers moved forward, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. "I am her mother. You cannot just come in here and take my baby because Dion lied to a judge. He is a liar." Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes and glancing toward the officers as if to silently say, "Look at this hysterical woman." "He didn't lie about your medical records, did he?" Brenda snapped, her tone shifting instantly from sugary sweetness to pure venom. "You were diagnosed by a licensed professional. You had panic attacks. You couldn't even get out of bed for months after she was born. You are a mentally unstable liability, and my son is simply protecting his child from a woman who can't even take care of herself." That was the exact moment the dam completely broke. Sophie collapsed to her knees on the hardwood floor, clinging tightly to Zoe, who was now crying loudly in confused, panicked bursts. It wasn't just sadness pouring out of my sister in that moment. It was 5 years of meticulously engineered psychological torture finally being dragged out into the light for everyone to see. "He is the reason I never got better," Sophie screamed, her words echoing off the high ceilings as she glared up at Brenda with absolute hatred burning in her eyes. "Don't you dare stand there and act like you don't know exactly what your son did. When the doctor told me I needed postpartum therapy, Dion refused to pay for it. He canceled my health insurance through his company plan. He told me psychologists were a scam, and that I was just being weak and embarrassing him. When I finally begged him for money to buy my anxiety medication, he took my debit card away entirely. He told me I couldn't be trusted with money. He isolated me in this house, cut me off completely from my family, and watched me drown in my own mind. He manufactured my depression. He starved me of any real help so he could build a paper trail to use against me. Exactly like this." Brenda didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her diamond earrings and looked down at Sophie with absolute, unapologetic contempt. "Excuses are the language of the weak," Brenda sneered coldly. "A real mother would have found a way. Now give me my granddaughter before these officers arrest you for violating a federal court order." Sophie turned her tear-streaked face toward me, grabbing the fabric of my uniform pants with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. "Natalie, please," Sophie begged, her voice entirely shattered, breaking into breathless sobs. "Please don't let them take her. You have to fight them. You have a badge. Do something, please. They're going to give her to Ashley. They're going to replace me. Please." Every protective instinct in my entire body screamed at me to draw my weapon, to stand blocking the doorway, to tear Brenda apart with my bare hands. But I am a federal investigator. I know exactly how the law works. If I interfered with a signed judge's order right then and there, I would be arrested immediately. I would lose my security clearance, and Sophie would lose her only real strategic lifeline. Dion wanted me to react violently. He was counting on it. He wanted to prove that we really were the unhinged, dangerous people he'd claimed we were all along. I refused to play into his pathetic little game. I knelt down gently and carefully pried Sophie's fingers away from my uniform. I wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders and pressed my forehead against hers, taking one slow, deep breath. I looked directly into Zoe's terrified brown eyes and kissed her softly on the forehead. "It's going to be okay, sweetie," I whispered to my niece, keeping my voice as gentle and soft as I could manage. "You're going to go with your grandmother for a little sleepover. Mommy will see you again so soon. Be brave for us, okay?" I stood up, gently took Zoe from my sobbing sister's arms, and carried her over to Brenda. I never once broke eye contact with Brenda as I handed the little girl over to her. Brenda smiled triumphantly, clearly convinced she had finally, completely broken us. She turned sharply on her heel and walked out the door alongside the officers, leaving my sister utterly destroyed on the floor behind her. Sophie wailed, burying her face in her hands, her entire body shaking violently with grief. "How could you let them take her?" Sophie cried, striking the floor with her fist over and over. "He won. He has everything now. He took my baby." I walked calmly over to the dining table and unzipped my black tactical backpack. I didn't offer her any empty words of comfort. I pulled out my heavy, encrypted government-issue laptop and set it down on the wood with a solid, deliberate thud. I opened the screen, typed in my security credentials, and brought up the secure Federal Database Access terminal. I looked down at my sister, my voice completely devoid of emotion now, sharp as a blade. He thinks he won a street fight because he threw the first punch, but Dion has absolutely no idea what he just started. Let them have her for 48 hours. I'm not going to waste my time arguing with some local family court judge over a temporary order. When you hunt a rat, you don't chase it through the walls. You find its nest. I packed Sophie into my truck and drove us to a secure extended-stay hotel located near the highway. I paid entirely in cash to avoid leaving any immediate digital footprint behind us. Once we were settled inside the sterile, quiet room, I ordered my sister to take a hot shower and try to get some rest. She curled up on the edge of the cheap mattress, staring blankly at the wall, completely hollowed out by the sudden loss of her daughter. I didn't try to offer any empty platitudes, and I didn't tell her that everything happens for a reason. Instead, I pulled the heavy chair out from the small laminate desk, plugged my encrypted government laptop into the wall outlet, and accessed the secure portal for the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. My clearance level as a special agent within the Major Procurement Fraud Unit gave me access to financial tracking databases that local family court judges and neighborhood police officers didn't even know existed. I ran Dion's full legal name, his social security number, and the tax identification number for his supposedly massive corporate firm. For years, Dion had paraded around in front of our family as though he were the ultimate self-made man. He constantly flaunted his supposedly lucrative consulting business to anyone within earshot who would listen. I remembered a country club dinner from 2 years ago where he wore a custom Italian suit and purchased a $1,000 bottle of wine to impress his wealthy golfing buddies. That very same night, I watched him drag Sophie out into the parking lot and viciously scream at her simply because she had asked him for $20 to buy Zoe a new winter coat. Brenda had stood right there defending her son the entire time, telling Sophie she needed to stop being so greedy and start respecting the man who put a roof over her head. Dion had convinced everyone around him that he was a titan of industry, a man single-handedly carrying the heavy financial weight of his ungrateful, lazy wife. But as the federal financial tracking software began steadily pulling his tax returns, credit reports, and bank records, his entire carefully constructed illusion shattered into a million pieces. Dion didn't actually have a consulting firm. What he had was a poorly constructed shell company. The corporate entity he loved bragging about had exactly 0 registered clients, 0 invoiced accounts receivable, and 0 legitimate corporate income for the past 3 consecutive years. The sleek downtown office space he claimed to rent was nothing more than a virtual mailbox service. The luxury SUV he drove around town was financed through a high-interest lease he was currently 3 months behind on. The man was, in truth, completely broke. But then a critical question hit me. If he had no legitimate income whatsoever, how exactly was he affording custom suits, expensive champagne, and diamond jewelry for a 27-year-old mistress? I cross-referenced his bank routing numbers against the Federal Reserve tracking system, following the money backward through a tangled maze of shell accounts. When the original source of the funds finally loaded up on my screen, a wave of pure, unfiltered rage washed over me. I had to grip the edge of the desk just to stop my hands from shaking visibly. Dion wasn't merely a liar and an abuser. He was, it turned out, a brazen federal criminal. 2 years earlier, while I had been deployed on a 9-month combat tour in the Middle East, I had left a limited power of attorney document sitting inside a family-safe deposit box. It had been intended strictly for handling medical emergencies concerning our elderly father. Somehow, Dion had gained illegal access to that secure box, altered the scope of the legal authorization, and forged my signature onto the document. Using that fraudulently altered power of attorney, Dion had walked directly into a local branch of the Navy Federal Credit Union. Posing as the legally authorized representative of an active duty deployed soldier, he took out a massive $250,000 second mortgage against my home. He used the equity I had built up, backed by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, and siphoned it directly into his fake consulting business account. That was the true source of his sudden wealth. He had been living like a king by stealing federal military benefits from his own sister-in-law while she was actively serving in a combat zone overseas. He had drained the equity of the house entirely, which finally explained why he had been so desperate to force Sophie and me out and change the locks in the first place. He needed to sell the house, or let it default, before I ever discovered the fraudulent second mortgage he'd taken out in secret. I kept digging, pulling the full transactional history tied to the stolen military funds. Every swipe, every wire transfer, every single ATM withdrawal told the sickening story of exactly how he had systematically tortured my sister over the years. I saw a $500 steakhouse receipt dated the exact same night Sophie had called me crying because Dion told her they couldn't afford to buy groceries that week. I saw a $10,000 charge for Ashley's diamond jewelry, paid for with the very same stolen military loan money he'd taken directly from my name. He had weaponized my blood, sweat, and years of military service to fund both his infidelity and the systematic destruction of my sister's life from the inside out. He genuinely believed he was some kind of absolute genius. He believed that because he wore a nice suit, drove a nice car, and spoke with aggressive, unearned authority, no one would ever dare question his paperwork. I opened the pending transactions queue tied to his primary checking account, tracking his activity in real time. The screen refreshed, and a red flag alert immediately popped up from the Federal Wire tracking system. Dion was actively moving money at that very second. Sitting right there in the pending outbound queue was an international wire transfer for exactly $50,000. The recipient account belonged to Ashley, but it was the memo line attached to the transfer that brought a cold, lethal smile spreading slowly across my face. Dion had typed out a very specific note for the bank transfer. It read, "Down payment for our new life." He was actively trying to stash the stolen federal funds inside his mistress's account before the divorce proceedings had even officially begun. Entirely unaware that he had just documented his own guilt in writing and simultaneously committed yet another massive count of felony wire fraud. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, held inside the bleak, fluorescent-lit halls of the county family court. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors alongside Sophie, who by that point looked like nothing more than a ghost of her former self. She wore a simple, conservative dress and held her hands tightly clasped together in her lap as we took our seats at the defense table. The door swung open again, and Dion marched in as though he were attending some kind of red carpet premiere. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit and a silk tie, radiating the smug confidence of a man who fully believed his own lies. Trailing close behind him was his expensive, shark-like attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Brenda and Ashley took their seats in the gallery directly behind Dion. Ashley had the sheer audacity to wear a designer blouse that I immediately recognized. It had been purchased using the very credit card Dion opened using my stolen military identity. Brenda caught my eye and offered a sickeningly triumphant little wave, fully convinced she had already won the entire war. Dion didn't even bother looking at his wife. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket, sat down, and whispered some private joke to his lawyer. When the judge finally entered the courtroom, the entire atmosphere shifted instantly from arrogant to fiercely adversarial. The judge was a stern older man who looked thoroughly exhausted by the endless stream of domestic disputes cluttering his docket. Dion's lawyer wasted absolutely no time. He stood up and launched straight into a meticulously crafted opening statement, One specifically designed to paint my sister as an abusive, neglectful dependent who posed an active threat to her own child. He painted a picture of a successful, hard-working father who had sacrificed everything to provide a luxurious lifestyle for a woman who refused to contribute anything in return. The lawyer presented the court with heavily redacted, out-of-context medical records. He highlighted the exact date Sophie had been prescribed anti-anxiety medication, conveniently leaving out the fact that Dion himself had caused her panic attacks and then deliberately blocked her access to therapy. He claimed Sophie spent her days either sleeping or screaming at her husband, creating what he called a highly volatile and dangerous environment for young Zoe. The lawyer stated that Dion had simply been acting as any protective father would when he secured that emergency restraining order. Sophie gripped my hand tightly under the table, her fingernails digging painfully into my palm as she was forced to sit there and listen to a complete stranger assassinate her entire character, while the man who had actually destroyed her life sat calmly beside his lawyer, looking every bit like a saint. To seal the coffin, Dion's attorney called Brenda up to the witness stand. Brenda approached the wooden box with the slow, deliberate steps of a grieving grandmother. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and immediately launched into an absolute masterclass of perjury. She pulled a tissue from her pocket, dabbing at eyes that held absolutely no genuine tears whatsoever. "Your Honor," Brenda said, her voice trembling with entirely fabricated emotion. "I love my daughter-in-law. We tried so hard to help her, but she is dangerously unstable. Just last year, there was a terrifying incident where she completely abandoned my granddaughter. Dion was away on an important business trip, working hard to pay their mortgage, and Sophie simply left the house. She left little Zoe all alone to fend for herself for hours, until I finally rushed over to intervene. A mother who abandons her baby like that should never be allowed anywhere near a child again." Sophie couldn't take it any longer. The gaslighting had grown far too severe, far too cruel to bear in silence. She shot up out of her chair, her voice echoing violently against the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. "I did not abandon her," Sophie screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Brenda. "You know exactly where I was. I was bleeding in the back of an ambulance because my appendix had ruptured. I called Dion, begging him to come home from his golf weekend with his friends to watch Zoe, and he told me to take an Uber and stop ruining his vacation. You came over afterward complaining that I was inconveniencing your son." "Order in this court!" the judge barked sharply, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sound block with enough force to make the bailiff jump. He pointed his finger fiercely in my sister's direction. "Ma'am, if you cannot control your outbursts, I will have you removed from this courtroom and held in criminal contempt. You do not speak unless spoken to directly. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" Sophie collapsed back down into her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She had been completely defeated by a system that demanded flawless composure from its victims, while simultaneously rewarding the calm, practiced lies of their abusers. Dion smirked at his lawyer and gave a small, deliberate nod, the kind of gesture practiced enough to look accidental. Brenda stepped down from the witness stand with slow, theatrical dignity, casting one last pitying glance toward the judge as if she, not Sophie, were the wounded party. The performance was flawless, polished by weeks of rehearsal. Dion had used his money and his mother's carefully constructed lies to build an almost impenetrable wall of deception, brick by brick, lie by lie. The judge sighed heavily and rubbed his temples, paging through the thick stack of fabricated evidence Dion's attorney had submitted that morning. The courtroom sat in agonizing silence, broken only by the muffled sound of my sister crying softly into her hands at the defense table. The judge leaned forward and clasped his hands together on the high wooden bench, his expression grim. "Based on the testimony presented today," the judge said, his voice cold and authoritative, and the documented medical history of severe emotional instability, I am deeply concerned for the welfare of the minor child. I am fully prepared to grant the petitioner, the father, permanent sole legal and physical custody. Furthermore, given the financial burden this arrangement will place on the father, I am prepared to order the respondent to pay monthly child support. Dion leaned back in his chair, a slow, victorious grin spreading across his face like oil across water. Brenda and Ashley exchanged excited whispers in the gallery, practically giddy. The judge looked down at our table with stern, weary eyes. "Before I make my final ruling official," he said, "does the defense have any final evidence to present to this court?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, rising from the defense table. My voice was steady, cutting cleanly through the heavy tension pressing down on the room. "I do have final evidence to present. I am the legal owner of the residence where the child resided, and I have direct video evidence regarding the actual living conditions and the petitioner's behavior toward both my sister and my niece." I stepped out from behind the table and walked forward, unhurried, toward the witness stand. I carried no stack of fabricated medical documents, no folder thick with lies, only a single encrypted titanium USB drive, which I pulled from the pocket of my uniform trousers and handed directly to the court bailiff. Dion's attorney shot up out of his chair as if the seat had caught fire. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, fumbling with his tie. "This is highly irregular. We have not been provided with this evidence during discovery. We do not know the source, the context, or the validity of whatever is on that drive. This is an ambush." The judge looked down at me, eyebrows raised in a sharp, silent question. "Ma'am, what exactly is on this drive, and why was it not submitted prior to this emergency hearing?" "Your Honor," I replied, keeping my composure absolute, unshaken. "As the verified homeowner, I maintain the security systems for the property. The petitioner, Dion, routinely disabled the primary household security cameras to conceal his extramarital affairs from his wife. However, because I was deployed overseas and needed to ensure the safety of my own property, I legally installed a secondary covert security camera inside the living room smoke detector. It records continuously to a secure cloud server. The footage on that drive was captured just 3 days ago. It has not been doctored, and it directly contradicts every single piece of testimony the petitioner and his mother have just sworn to under oath." The judge's expression hardened instantly. He turned his gaze on Dion, whose smug smile had already vanished, replaced by a chalky, sickly pallor. The judge instructed the bailiff to plug the drive into the courtroom's audiovisual system. The large wall-mounted monitor flickered to life, and the high-definition military-grade camera provided a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the entire living room. A timestamp in the lower right corner confirmed the exact date and time, undeniable. The footage began to play, and the full, ugly truth of my sister's daily life was finally broadcast for the whole courtroom to witness. On the screen, Sophie stood holding little Zoe, begging Dion for money to buy groceries for the week. Dion towered over her, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unrestrained rage. The audio was flawless. Every person in that courtroom heard him screaming at his wife, calling her worthless, a parasite, a pathetic excuse for a mother who did not deserve a single dime of his money. Then came the physical escalation. On screen, Dion lunged forward and shoved Sophie violently against the wall. Zoe shrieked in terror, clinging desperately to her mother's leg. Instead of stopping, Dion grabbed his crying 4-year-old daughter by the arm, yanked her away from Sophie, and dragged her down the hallway. The camera captured him hurling Zoe into the small windowless laundry room and slamming the heavy door shut, locking it from the outside. The muffled, terrified screams of a small child echoed out of the courtroom speakers, sending a collective chill rippling through the room. But the video was not finished. Dion walked back into the living room, straightened his tailored shirt as if nothing had happened, and unlocked the front door. Ashley walked in, wearing the exact same designer blouse she currently had on in the gallery. Dion poured 2 glasses of wine, handed one to his mistress, and pulled her down onto the leather couch, completely ignoring the desperate, muffled cries of his own daughter locked in the dark just a few feet away. I turned my head to look at the gallery. Brenda sat frozen, her jaw literally hanging open, her eyes wide with unfiltered shock. For the first time in her life, she could not spin a narrative to protect her precious son. The undeniable proof of his monstrous behavior played out directly in front of her face, inescapable. Ashley looked like she might be sick, sinking lower and lower into her seat, suddenly realizing that her wealthy, successful boyfriend was a violent abuser who had locked his own toddler in a closet simply to make room for her. Dion's expensive lawyer slowly sank back down into his chair. He said nothing further. He raised no objection. He simply began quietly packing his files back into his leather briefcase, silently distancing himself from a client who had just committed blatant perjury and documented child abuse in open court. At the defense table, Sophie was sobbing softly, but this time the tears were not tears of defeat. They were tears of overwhelming, staggering relief. The invisible chains Dion had wrapped around her mind for years were finally broken. The court had at last seen the truth she had been screaming about for years, unheard. The judge pressed a button on his desk to stop the playback. The courtroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence, thick with tension. He slowly turned his gaze toward the petitioner's table. His face carried an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. The exhaustion that had clouded his eyes only minutes earlier was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, furious clarity. "Mr. Petitioner," the judge began, his voice dangerously low, rumbling with authority. "You came into my courtroom, filed an emergency order under the guise of protecting a child, and presented sworn testimony claiming the mother was a danger. You weaponized the legal system and the police to facilitate your own cruelty. You committed perjury. Your mother committed perjury." Dion opened his mouth, raising his hands defensively, stammering out a pathetic excuse. "Your Honor, that video is taken entirely out of context. She provoked me. I was just trying to give the child a timeout." The judge did not let him finish. He snatched up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sound block with the terrifying force of a gunshot. The crack echoed violently through the silent room. "Custody reversed," the judge commanded, his voice booming with absolute finality. The bailiff moved immediately toward the petitioner's table, instructing Dion to hand over any documents related to the child. Dion did not argue. He knew better than to risk criminal contempt on the official record. He stood, buttoned his custom suit jacket with trembling fingers, and shot a look of pure, unadulterated venom across the aisle, the look of a cornered predator realizing too late that his own trap had just snapped shut on his leg. Brenda rushed out of the courtroom with her head down, thoroughly humiliated, Ashley trailing awkwardly behind her, unsure of her own footing anymore. We walked out of that courthouse with the emergency custody order completely reversed. Sophie finally had her daughter back, legally and safely. But I knew men like Dion. When narcissists lose control in public, they resort to scorched earth tactics behind closed doors, and the retaliation began before we had even reached my truck in the parking lot. Sophie pulled out her phone to call Zoe's preschool and let the teachers know she would be picking her up early. The screen flashed an error message. The cellular network was unavailable. Dion had instantly canceled her phone line, cutting off her ability to communicate with the outside world in one quiet, deliberate stroke. An hour later, as we drove toward the school, my federal encrypted phone buzzed with an alert from a flag I had set on the county database. Dion had just canceled the auto insurance policy on the modest sedan Sophie drove. He was systematically trying to trap her, ensuring that if she so much as tried to drive her own child anywhere, she would risk arrest and further custody complications for operating an uninsured vehicle. He was burning the bridge with both of them still standing on it. After picking up Zoe, who practically leapt into her mother's arms crying with pure joy, we stopped at a local supermarket. Zoe was hungry, and Sophie wanted to buy her favorite macaroni and cheese along with some fresh fruit to celebrate having her daughter back. I stood near the magazine rack while Sophie pushed the red plastic cart toward the checkout lane. The store was crowded with late-afternoon shoppers, tired and impatient. The cashier rang up the small pile of groceries totaling $42. Sophie swiped her joint checking account debit card. The machine beeped an angry red. Declined. She frowned, apologized to the cashier, and tried her secondary credit card. Declined again. The line behind her began to shift impatiently, shoes shuffling on tile. A woman holding a crying baby sighed loudly. Sophie's face flushed crimson as she tried a third card. Declined. Just as the cashier asked whether she had another form of payment, Sophie's deactivated phone, which had automatically latched onto the supermarket's free public Wi-Fi, pinged with an incoming message. She looked down at the illuminated screen. Dion had transferred every last penny out of their joint accounts into an unknown private account. He had also maxed out the credit cards she held by taking cash advances against them. Right below the automated bank notification sat a text message from Dion himself. A laughing emoji, followed by 5 mocking words. Have fun feeding her dirt. Sophie left the cart at the register, grabbed Zoe's hand, and ran out through the automatic doors into the parking lot. By the time I caught up with her, she was leaning against the side of my truck, gasping for air, her whole body shaking with humiliated sobs. Zoe looked up at her mother, her small lip trembling in confusion, not understanding any of it. I lifted Zoe gently into her car seat and shut the heavy door so she would not hear what came next. I turned back to Sophie, who was clutching the useless plastic cards in her hands as if they were physically burning her skin. He took everything, she gasped, tears streaming down her face as she stared blankly at the asphalt. He emptied the checking account. He drained Zoe's college fund. I have absolutely nothing left, Natalie. I cannot even buy my daughter a box of pasta. He did this to me every single week for 5 years. If I did not smile the right way, if I did not clean the house exactly how he wanted, he would log into the portal and freeze the accounts. I had to literally get on my knees and beg him for a $50 weekly allowance just to buy diapers and milk. He kept me financially paralyzed so I could never afford to leave him, and now I am finally free, and I still cannot even feed my own child. He won. He still controls whether we survive. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not pat her shoulder and promise it would all be fine. I simply reached out, calmly pulled the deactivated plastic cards from her trembling fingers, walked back into the crowded supermarket, handed the annoyed cashier a crisp $100 bill, and walked back out carrying the groceries. I handed the paper bags to Sophie, who stared at me with red, swollen eyes, and then I walked over to a concrete trash can and dropped her useless credit cards straight into the garbage. I stepped close to my sister and looked her directly in the eyes. A cold, calculated smile spread across my face. Let him cut the phone lines, I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. Let him cancel the car insurance. Let him drain every single account he can get his greedy hands on. Because what Dion does not realize is that the money in those joint accounts is inextricably tied to the fraudulent military loan he took out in my name. Every time he hits transfer on his banking app, every account he drains trying to starve you out, every dollar he moves across state lines, he is committing another heavily documented count of federal wire fraud. He thinks he is starving you out. He is actually just digging his own federal grave, and he is handing me the shovel. We drove back to the hotel and let Dion believe, for one night, that he had won the financial war. I spent the evening compiling transaction logs into a secure federal dossier, building an airtight case that would guarantee his prison sentence. But criminals like Dion and his mother do not have the patience to let their victims quietly suffer. They need immediate, visible submission. The very next morning, before the banks had even opened, Dion made his most desperate and reckless move yet. He attempted to physically bypass the federal judge's custody reversal. Because Sophie's phone was still deactivated, my government-issued cell phone rang at exactly 9:30 a.m. It was Mrs. Higgins, the principal at Zoe's preschool, whom I had spoken with the day before to update the emergency contact list. Her voice trembled with panic. She told me Brenda was standing in the school lobby, screaming at the receptionist, demanding to take Zoe out of class immediately. Brenda was waving around an outdated copy of the emergency custody order, claiming my sister was having a psychotic break and was medically unfit to care for her own daughter. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my keys, and called out for Sophie. We made the 10-minute drive to the preschool in less than 6. I parked my truck directly on the curb in front of the main entrance. For the first time in 5 years, Sophie did not look terrified. Brenda's sheer audacity in trying to steal her daughter right out of a classroom had burned away the last remnants of her fear, leaving behind nothing but the fierce, primal rage of a protective mother. We pushed through the glass double doors and walked straight into chaos. Brenda stood in the middle of the brightly colored hallway, clutching her designer handbag, berating a young receptionist who looked like she might burst into tears. "You will go into that classroom and get my granddaughter right this second," Brenda shouted, her voice echoing violently past the construction paper artwork taped to the wall. "I am her legal guardian. Her mother is a clinically diagnosed lunatic. If you do not hand that child over to me, I will have your job, and I will sue this entire school district for child endangerment." Sophie did not hesitate. She marched down the hallway and planted herself directly between Brenda and the doorway leading to the classrooms, shoulders squared, completely blocking the path. "You are not taking my daughter anywhere," Sophie said, her voice ringing out with a cold, hard authority I had never once heard from her before. "The judge reversed the order yesterday. Brenda, you and your son committed perjury, and if you take one more step toward that classroom, you will be arrested for attempted kidnapping." Brenda spun around, her eyes flashing with pure malice, looking at Sophie as though she were something to be crushed underfoot. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she spat, stepping aggressively into my sister's personal space. "You are nothing. You were a pathetic charity case we rescued from a mediocre life. Dion gave you a beautiful home. He clothed you, he fed you, and you ruined his life with your toxic, needy behavior. You do not deserve to raise a child. You are completely incompetent." Brenda reached out and shoved Sophie's shoulder, trying to physically push past her toward the classroom door. But Sophie did not stumble, did not fall back. She stood her ground like a stone wall and shoved Brenda's hand away with startling force. "Do not ever touch me again," Sophie screamed, her voice overpowering Brenda's completely. "I am not your charity case. I was your son's prisoner. And do not stand here in a school hallway playing the righteous grandmother when you are nothing but a disgusting hypocrite who actively helped him destroy our family." "You think I am stupid?" Brenda scoffed, trying to reclaim her superior posture. "You think I did not know what was going on?" "I know exactly what you did," Sophie continued, pointing a finger directly at Brenda's chest, her voice unleashing a barrage that left the older woman completely speechless. "I know you covered for him on New Year's Eve last year. You told me he was sick in your guest room, but he was actually at a downtown hotel with Ashley. I know about the so-called business trip to Miami in February. You paid for Ashley's plane ticket on your own credit card so the charge would not show up on our joint bank statement. You sat at my dining table, ate the food I cooked, kissed my cheek, and then helped your son carry on a pathetic affair right behind my back. You are not a protector. You are an enabler to an abuser." The receptionist gasped, hand flying to her mouth. The school principal, Mrs. Higgins, stepped out of her office, face pale, phone receiver still in hand. "I am calling the police right now," she announced, her voice shaking. This behavior is completely unacceptable on school grounds. I stepped out from the shadows near the entrance and cut her off before she could dial another number. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out my heavy silver federal badge and flipped it open for the principal to see. "That will not be necessary, Mrs. Higgins," I said calmly, taking full control of the room. "I am a special agent with the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. I have jurisdiction over this situation, and I am handling it personally." I walked slowly toward Brenda, who was suddenly breathing hard, her earlier arrogance rapidly deflating at the sight of federal credentials. She tried to step back, but I closed the distance, backing her against the wall of children's cubbies, leaning in close enough that no one else in the hallway could hear what came next. "You think you're protecting your son's money?" I whispered, my voice dripping with venom. "I have the mortgage documents, Brenda." I saw the forged notary stamp at the bottom of the page. "You witnessed a forged federal loan document used to steal $250,000 from the United States military. When the FBI kicks your front door down next week, they are not just coming for Dion. They are coming for you." Brenda turned completely ghost white, the color draining from her face so fast she looked ready to faint. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She dropped her fake emergency custody papers onto the linoleum floor, turned, and practically sprinted out of the building, leaving the heavy glass doors swinging wildly behind her. Once she was gone, I turned to the principal and assured her the immediate threat had been neutralized. Sophie walked into the classroom and emerged a moment later carrying Zoe, who clutched a painting of a bright yellow sun, entirely oblivious to the war that had just been fought over her freedom in a school hallway. We did not take Zoe back into the active war zone. Instead, I called a trusted colleague from my federal unit, a fellow agent, who drove straight to our secure hotel to watch over Zoe and guarantee her safety. With my niece protected under the watchful eye of federal law enforcement, Sophie and I had one final errand to run. We needed to retrieve her essential legal documents, her remaining winter clothes, and the heirloom jewelry our late grandmother had left her. We drove back to the sprawling, manicured subdivision where my house sat. The affluent neighborhood was quiet in the crisp, mid-morning light, professional landscapers humming somewhere in the distance. We pulled into the wide concrete driveway, and Sophie walked up to the front porch, keychain jingling in her trembling hand. She slid her brass key into the deadbolt we had left damaged during my initial break-in 2 nights earlier, but the key did not even go in. She tried the secondary lock on the handle. Nothing. The entire locking mechanism had been replaced with a high-tech digital keypad and reinforced steel deadbolts. Dion had fortified the property against its own legal owner. Before I could even inspect the new hardware to determine the best point of entry, a customized electric golf cart rolled silently to a stop at the edge of the driveway. A man in a pastel blue polo shirt, pressed khaki shorts, and a polished silver watch stepped out. Mr. Prescott, president of the local homeowners association, a notoriously pompous man who governed the neighborhood like it was his own personal kingdom. He marched up the driveway with a silver clipboard in hand and a deep scowl on his face, looking at us as though we were common vandals defacing public property. "Excuse me, ladies," Mr. Prescott announced loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "You need to step away from that property immediately. Dion called me early this morning to inform the board that unauthorized individuals might attempt to trespass today. He provided a very clear list of people permanently banned from the premises, and frankly, I am entirely appalled that you would cause a disturbance in broad daylight in our peaceful community." I glanced up at the massive second-story window of the master bedroom. The thick wooden blinds were parted just an inch, and I could clearly see Dion standing there in the shadows, looking down at us with a smug, arrogant grin, a ceramic cup of coffee in hand. He was thoroughly enjoying the show, watching his local pawn do his dirty work for him, genuinely convinced he had outsmarted the entire system by hiding behind community bylaws. Sophie turned to face the HOA president, her expression flushed with disbelief. Mr. Prescott, this is my home, she said, desperately trying to maintain her composure. My personal belongings are inside. My daughter's winter clothes are inside. He changed the locks illegally, and I just need to get my things before we leave. Mr. Prescott let out a harsh, patronizing sigh, crossing his arms over his chest and looking down his nose at her. Now, Sophie, let us not make a scene on the front lawn, he said, lowering his voice into a tone of fake pity that instantly made my skin crawl. Dion has been very transparent with the board about your ongoing personal struggles. We all know about your severe drinking problem. It is a tragedy, really. It perfectly explains why you never showed up to the summer block parties, the holiday galas, the charity fundraisers. Dion had to attend all of those events alone, covering for you while you were locked inside sleeping off a drunken bender. He has suffered enough trying to keep this family afloat. The board fully supports his difficult decision to remove a volatile, raging alcoholic from our pristine community. If you do not leave right now, I will personally call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Sophie gasped aloud, stepping backward as if she had been struck across the face. The full magnitude of Dion's psychological manipulation had finally become visible to the outside world. He had not simply isolated her by taking her money and her phone. He had systematically assassinated her character in front of the entire neighborhood. Every time he locked her inside the house and refused to let her attend a single gathering, he had walked next door, sipped their expensive wine, and told the neighbors his wife was a raging drunk who could not be trusted in public. He had isolated her from any potential friends by making everyone pity him and quietly despise her instead. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a man foolish enough to blindly believe a con artist. I did not try to explain the truth to Mr. Prescott, and I did not defend my sister's honor to a stranger. I simply turned, walked down the long driveway, and went straight to the trunk of my tactical vehicle. I hit the release latch, pulled back the heavy canvas mat, and retrieved a solid steel military-grade crowbar, matte black, 3 feet long, heavy enough to break through reinforced concrete. Mr. Prescott's eyes went wide with panic as I marched back up the driveway holding the weapon. "Ma'am, what on earth are you doing?" he shouted frantically, dropping his silver clipboard onto the concrete. "You cannot do that here. I am warning you. I will call the police this instant." I did not break my stride. I walked right past his trembling frame, stepped up onto the concrete porch, and swung the heavy steel crowbar back over my shoulder. With every ounce of strength I possessed, I drove the metal wedge directly into the center of the custom digital lock Dion had just installed. The impact sounded like a small bomb detonating. The keypad shattered into 100 jagged plastic pieces. I wedged the crowbar deep into the splintered doorframe and yanked sideways with a terrifying crack. The reinforced steel deadbolt snapped clean in half, and the heavy front door swung wide open, slamming violently against the interior hallway wall. Upstairs, the wooden blinds in the master bedroom slammed shut. Dion was not laughing anymore. I pulled the crowbar free from the splintered wood, stepped casually over the shattered plastic and broken glass scattered across the porch, and reached into my uniform pocket for a folded copy of the official property deed. I turned to Mr. Prescott, who stood frozen on the driveway, staring at the destroyed door with his mouth hanging open in sheer terror, and shoved the document directly into his chest. "I am the legal owner of this property," I stated, my voice devoid of any emotion. "That man hiding inside is a federal criminal currently trespassing in my home. If the Homeowners Association has a problem with how I choose to remodel my own front door, you can bill me." I left the HOA president standing on the driveway, a statue of pure, impotent shock, and stepped right over the shattered remnants of the doorframe. Sophie followed close behind, her boots crunching over broken plastic. The moment we crossed into the grand foyer, the familiar scent of my sister's vanilla and cedar candles hit my senses, though the house itself now felt entirely violated. Dion had clearly retreated to the upstairs guest bedroom, too much of a coward to face me after watching me dismantle his expensive security system with one swing of a crowbar. But he was not the only rat hiding inside the nest. We walked past the pristine living room and headed straight for the master suite on the ground floor to retrieve Sophie's belongings. I pushed open the heavy double doors, and the sight waiting inside tightened my grip around the crowbar I was still carrying. Ashley stood in the center of Sophie's massive walk-in closet, not merely rummaging through my sister's things, but actively wearing them. She had squeezed herself into Sophie's custom-tailored silk blouse and a pair of expensive designer heels Dion had bought Sophie 2 anniversaries earlier. Sitting open on the plush velvet ottoman was a large leather overnight bag, into which Ashley was methodically packing my sister's most expensive winter coats, her designer handbags, and, worst of all, the antique wooden jewelry box holding the pieces our late grandmother had passed down to her. Sophie froze in the doorway, staring at the woman who had helped destroy her family now casually shopping through her closet as if it were a boutique. "What do you think you are doing?" Sophie demanded, her voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of disbelief and fury. "Take my clothes off right now and step away from my grandmother's jewelry." Ashley jumped slightly, startled by our sudden appearance. She had clearly assumed the locked front door would keep us out forever. But instead of showing an ounce of shame, she quickly recovered her arrogant posture, glanced at Sophie, then at the crowbar in my hand, and let out a dismissive scoff before zipping the leather bag halfway shut, entirely ignoring my sister's command. "I am taking what belongs to me," Ashley said, her voice dripping with unapologetic entitlement. "Dion told me to pack up anything I wanted before the movers come to clear out the rest of your trash. He bought all of this with his money anyway. He promised me this lifestyle, and I am not leaving empty-handed just because you decided to throw a temper tantrum and break a door." The sheer audacity was almost hard to process. She stood in a house she did not own, wearing clothes she had not bought, packing stolen family heirlooms, acting like the rightful queen of a castle that was not hers. Sophie stepped further into the closet, closing the distance between them. The timid, terrified woman who had been thrown out into the rain a few nights earlier was entirely gone. "He bought nothing," Sophie said, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "Every single thing in this room was bought with money he stole. And that jewelry box belonged to my grandmother. It has been in my family for 50 years. Put it down, Ashley." Ashley rolled her eyes, clutching the wooden box to her chest like a spoiled child. "You are so pathetic, Sophie," she sneered, stepping forward to intimidate my sister. "Do you really think he ever loved you? Dion told me everything about your miserable little marriage. He told me you were nothing but a placeholder, a convenient, naive girl he could use to look good on paper until he built his business. He said he was always waiting to find a woman who actually matched his aesthetic. Someone who was not a weak, medicated burden. He chose me. He wants me in this house, wearing these clothes, living this life. You are just a bitter ex-wife who could not keep her man happy." For 5 years, Sophie had swallowed every insult, every degradation, every cruel word Dion and his mother had thrown at her. She had been conditioned to shrink, to apologize, to absorb the abuse in silence. But hearing this arrogant, entitled 27-year-old mistress parrot the exact same abusive language while standing in her closet and stealing her grandmother's wedding ring was the final trigger. The dam did not simply break. It exploded. Sophie did not yell. She did not cry. She raised her right hand and slapped Ashley across the face with so much force that the crack echoed through the entire master suite. Ashley shrieked, stumbling backward into a rack of hanging dresses, her hand flying to her bright red cheek, her eyes wide with utter shock, as though she had been struck by lightning. "You crazy witch!" Ashley screamed, tears of pain springing to her eyes. "I am calling the police on you. I am having you arrested for assault. You do that, Sophie hissed, chest heaving as she stood over her. Call the police. Let them come see you wearing my clothes and stealing my property. Ashley scrambled to her feet, entirely abandoning her arrogant facade. She grabbed the leather overnight bag with one hand and kept the antique jewelry box tucked under her other arm, trying to push past Sophie in a desperate attempt to escape the room and find Dion upstairs. I am leaving, she cried, voice trembling. You are both psychotic. She made it exactly 2 steps toward the bedroom door before I stepped squarely into the frame, blocking her exit completely. I did not raise my hands. I did not need to. I simply stood there, an immovable wall in a military uniform, looking down at her with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Move, Ashley demanded, trying to sound tough, though her voice cracked halfway through the word. I glanced down at the wooden box tucked under her arm. You can leave, I said softly, my tone dangerously calm. But the jewelry box stays? Ashley clutched it tighter. Dion gave this to me, she argued, stepping back. It is mine now. I tilted my head, offering her a smile completely devoid of warmth. I do not sweet. Ashley shrieked, stumbling backward into a rack of hanging dresses, her hand flying to her bright red cheek, her eyes wide with utter shock, as though she had been struck by lightning. You crazy witch! Ashley screamed, tears of pain springing to her eyes. I am calling the police on you. I am having you arrested for assault. You do that, Sophie hissed, chest heaving as she stood over her. Call the police. Let them come see you wearing my clothes and stealing my property. Ashley scrambled to her feet, entirely abandoning her arrogant facade. She grabbed the leather overnight bag with one hand and kept the antique jewelry box tucked under her other arm, trying to push past Sophie in a desperate attempt to escape the room and find Dion upstairs. I am leaving, she cried, voice trembling. You are both psychotic. She made it exactly 2 steps toward the bedroom door before I stepped squarely into the frame, blocking her exit completely. I did not raise my hands. I did not need to. I simply stood there, an immovable wall in a military uniform, looking down at her with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Move, Ashley demanded, trying to sound tough, though her voice cracked halfway through the word. I glanced down at the wooden box tucked under her arm. You can leave, I said softly, my tone dangerously calm. But the jewelry box stays? Ashley clutched it tighter. Dion gave this to me, she argued, stepping back. It is mine now. I tilted my head, offering her a smile completely devoid of warmth. I do not think you understand the legal gravity of your current situation, Ashley. That jewelry box contains a vintage diamond ring and a sapphire necklace. Because this home is federally insured under my military policy, those specific items are scheduled on a federal insurance rider. If you cross this threshold holding that box, it is no longer petty domestic theft. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper. It becomes grand larceny of federally insured property. And as a federal agent, I will not call the local police. I will personally handcuff you to the steering wheel of my truck and drive you straight to a federal holding cell. Now put the box down. Ashley did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She practically dropped the box onto the velvet ottoman, as though the polished wood had suddenly caught fire. Her hands shot up into the air, trembling violently. She backed out of the walk-in closet, shot me one final terrified look, and sprinted down the hallway toward the front door. We heard her heels clicking frantically over the broken glass on the porch before her car engine roared to life in the driveway. She abandoned Dion to face the consequences entirely alone. Sophie calmly picked up the heirloom box, packed her winter coats into her own suitcases, and we walked right out through the shattered front door, leaving Dion cowering upstairs in the guest bedroom, too paralyzed by his own cowardice to even look out the window. Over the following 48 hours, The reality of his rapidly collapsing empire must have finally dawned on Dion. He had lost physical custody of Zoe. He had already lost the one fortress that truly mattered the moment I shattered the locks on the empire he had built on stolen ground. Deep down, he knew the tide had shifted. Every forged document, every fraudulent transaction, every carefully hidden lie was beginning to surface, and the legal pressure surrounding him was tightening with relentless force. But men like Dion never admit defeat. A narcissist standing on the edge of total collapse doesn't pause to reflect, doesn't accept responsibility, and certainly doesn't apologize. Instead, they cling even harder to the illusion they've spent years constructing. When reality threatens to expose them, they create an even grander performance, hoping applause will drown out the truth. For Dion, wealth was never simply money, it was his identity. Every tailored suit, every luxury vehicle, every exclusive membership, every carefully staged photograph existed for one purpose: convincing the world that he was an untouchable corporate titan. The appearance of success mattered infinitely more than success itself. And that obsession became the weakness that would ultimately destroy him. Desperate to reclaim control of the narrative before the truth reached the public, Dion and Brenda organized an event so extravagant that it was impossible to ignore. Elegant digital invitations were delivered throughout the county, announcing an exclusive Engagement and New Beginnings gala at the prestigious Oak Creek Country Club, the most luxurious and expensive venue for miles. The message behind the celebration was obvious. Dion wanted everyone to believe he had survived the divorce without a scratch. He wanted friends, business contacts, neighbors, and extended family to see a confident man who had supposedly escaped a toxic marriage and was now beginning a glamorous new chapter with the perfect woman. It was theater, nothing more. Through my secure financial monitoring software, I watched every transaction unfold in real time. There was no guesswork, no assumptions. Every payment appeared on my screen exactly as it happened. The reservation alone required a $20,000 deposit. The ballroom, premium catering, a full luxury open bar, professional musicians, decorations, every unnecessary extravagance money could buy. But there was one problem. None of it belonged to him. Dion didn't use income from his consulting business because there wasn't any legitimate income to use. He didn't pay with corporate profits because the company barely existed beyond carefully crafted paperwork. Instead, he reached for the exact same credit account that had been funded using the fraudulent second mortgage he had forged in my name while I was deployed overseas. Every dollar financing his celebration had been stolen. Federal military benefits intended to protect a deployed service member were now paying for imported champagne, aged whiskey, premium seafood, gourmet appetizers, and luxury entertainment for wealthy country club guests who had absolutely no idea they were celebrating with stolen government money. Watching the payment clear, I couldn't help but shake my head. The arrogance was almost unbelievable. He wasn't simply committing fraud anymore. He was flaunting it. The evening of the party arrived beneath a perfectly clear autumn sky. The weather itself seemed determined to cooperate with Dion's fantasy. Inside Oak Creek Country Club, every detail had been meticulously arranged to project effortless luxury. Massive crystal chandeliers filled the ballroom with warm golden light that reflected across polished marble floors. 50 elegantly decorated round tables were draped in layers of expensive white silk, each centerpiece overflowing with fresh orchids and imported roses. A professional jazz quartet performed softly near the dance floor, creating the exact atmosphere Dion believed successful executives should enjoy. Servers dressed in immaculate black tuxedos moved gracefully through the crowd carrying polished silver trays loaded with champagne flutes, imported wine, handcrafted cocktails, and gourmet hors d'oeuvres that cost more than many families spent on groceries in a week. Everything looked flawless. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked fake. Brenda was thriving in the spotlight. Dressed in a sparkling emerald evening gown that caught every beam of chandelier light, she floated effortlessly from conversation to conversation with the confidence of a seasoned politician working a room full of wealthy donors. She greeted relatives. She charmed business acquaintances. She entertained neighborhood gossips. She made certain every guest heard exactly the version of events she wanted repeated throughout the county by morning. Fortunately for us, every carefully rehearsed lie reached my ears almost immediately. One of our federal informants had already infiltrated the event, posing as a junior member of the catering staff. Through a secure audio connection, I listened quietly as conversations unfolded around the ballroom. Near an elaborate ice sculpture carved into the shape of intertwined swans, Brenda placed a dramatic hand over her chest and sighed loudly enough for an entire circle of guests to hear. "It's been such a heartbreaking time for my son," she announced with perfectly rehearsed sympathy. "But thankfully, he's finally free." Several guests nodded politely. Brenda lowered her voice just enough to appear confidential. Sophie was weighing him down. She refused to contribute financially. Her emotional instability became unbearable, and she drained his accounts with reckless spending. Dion sacrificed everything trying to save that marriage. She paused long enough for everyone to absorb the lie. But eventually, she continued with a satisfied smile, "A man has to protect his own peace." A few people murmured their agreement. Brenda smiled wider. "Tonight isn't about the past. Tonight is about freedom, and about celebrating the beautiful future Dion deserves." She gestured proudly toward Ashley. Unlike his ex-wife, Ashley understands what it means to support a successful executive. The guests followed her gaze. Across the ballroom, Dion stood at the center of an admiring crowd, one arm wrapped confidently around Ashley's waist. She wore an elegant designer gown that almost certainly had been purchased using stolen money. Just 2 days earlier, she had been trembling in terror after being caught trying to steal Sophie's sapphire necklace. Now she laughed comfortably beneath the protection of Dion's carefully manufactured reputation. Glass in hand, Dion moved through conversations effortlessly, laughing loudly, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and performing the role of the triumphant survivor with practiced perfection. To everyone in that ballroom, he looked like a man who had conquered hardship. They believed Sophie was somewhere alone, broken, humiliated, financially ruined, perhaps crying inside a cheap motel room after losing everything. They imagined she had been erased from the story. They couldn't have been more wrong. 2 miles away from the country club, Sophie and I sat silently in the back of a rented black luxury town car. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been settled long before we climbed into the vehicle. Tonight wasn't about revenge fueled by anger. It was about truth. If Dion had chosen to wage war through appearances, then we were about to meet him on the very battlefield he had designed and destroy the illusion in front of every witness he had gathered. Gone were the combat boots I normally wore. Gone were the practical clothes that blended into the background. Tonight required something different. I wore a perfectly tailored black evening gown that projected quiet authority instead of extravagance. Its clean lines, understated elegance, and commanding silhouette reflected exactly who I was. A woman who never needed expensive jewelry or flashy designer labels to command respect. But it wasn't me people would remember. It was Sophie. When she stepped out of that car, the entire room was going to forget every lie they had been told. Her floor-length crimson gown fit her as though it had been designed exclusively for her. Professional makeup highlighted the confidence that had slowly returned to her face over the past few days, while her carefully styled hair framed features that no longer looked exhausted by fear. She looked healthy. She looked composed. Most importantly, she looked free. Around her neck rested the vintage sapphire necklace Ashley had tried to steal only 48 hours earlier. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It had become a declaration. A reminder that nothing Dion had attempted to take from her truly belonged to him. As the driver turned into the entrance of Oak Creek Country Club, the building shimmered beneath hundreds of carefully placed exterior lights. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, while uniformed valets hurried from one expensive car to the next. The scene resembled the premiere of a Hollywood gala. Perfect. Because every great performance deserves an unforgettable ending. The town car rolled to a smooth stop beneath the grand entrance canopy. Without hesitation, the chauffeur stepped out, opened our door, and extended his hand. Sophie accepted it first. Then I followed. The cool evening air brushed across our faces as we stepped onto the polished stone walkway. Several valets glanced toward us with polite curiosity. None of them questioned our presence. Why would they? We looked exactly like women who belonged there. We walked past the valet stand without slowing our pace. Our heels echoed softly across polished marble as we entered the magnificent lobby. Crystal lighting reflected from towering columns, while expensive floral arrangements filled the air with the subtle scent of fresh lilies. Ahead of us stood the enormous oak double doors leading into the ballroom. Through them drifted soft jazz music, polite laughter, and the steady hum of expensive conversations. The performance was reaching its climax. It was time to raise the curtain. Inside the ballroom, the jazz quartet finished another elegant number. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Near the center stage, Dion adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit before confidently stepping toward the microphone positioned beneath the grand chandelier. A server quickly handed him a crystal champagne flute. Dion smiled. Not because he was happy, because he believed he had already won. He tapped the rim of the glass gently with a silver spoon. The clear ringing sound spread throughout the ballroom. Conversations gradually faded. Guests turned toward the stage. Within moments, nearly every eye in the room rested on him, exactly as he intended. He flashed the charismatic smile that had fooled so many people for years. "I'd like to thank every one of you for being here tonight," he began smoothly. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. Life teaches us valuable lessons. Sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is recognizing when certain people no longer belong in your future. A few guests nodded. Others smiled politely. Dion continued. "You have to surround yourself with people who inspire greatness, people who believe in growth instead of holding you back." He wrapped an arm around Ashley's waist. She smiled proudly. "Tonight isn't about endings." He raised his champagne glass. "It's about new beginnings." The audience began preparing to applaud. "And finally becoming the man I was always meant to be." He lifted his glass even higher. "To new opportunities, to success, and to finally getting exactly what I deserve." The first hands had barely started moving toward applause when everything changed. The enormous oak doors exploded inward with a deafening crash. The violent impact echoed through the ballroom like thunder. Every conversation stopped instantly. Champagne glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. The jazz musicians lowered their instruments. Complete silence swallowed the room. Every guest turned toward the entrance. Sophie and I stood framed beneath the warm golden light spilling in from the lobby. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Our presence alone shattered the illusion Dion had spent months constructing. The ballroom had expected broken women. Instead, they saw strength. Sophie's crimson gown flowed elegantly around her as she stepped forward with calm confidence. I matched her pace exactly, our heels striking the polished marble in perfect rhythm. Each step echoed through the stunned silence. Neither of us hurried. Predators never rush. Across the room, Dion simply stared. His champagne flute stopped inches from his mouth. The practiced smile vanished so completely that it looked as though someone had erased it from his face. Color drained from his skin. His eyes widened. For the first time that evening, he looked terrified. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the violinist stood frozen with his bow suspended above the strings. 50 tables filled with executives, bankers, attorneys, politicians, and wealthy socialites watched us cross the ballroom as though witnessing something impossible. Because according to everything Brenda had spent the evening telling them, we shouldn't have looked like this. We weren't supposed to appear elegant. We weren't supposed to appear confident. We certainly weren't supposed to look victorious. We looked exactly like women who had come to collect something that already belonged to them. Dion slammed his champagne glass onto a nearby cocktail table. The crystal struck the surface so violently that several guests jumped. Amber liquid spilled across the immaculate white tablecloth. His panic transformed almost instantly into fury. Without another word, he stormed down the carpeted steps from the stage, shoving past several startled guests as he marched directly toward us. Brenda followed immediately behind him. Her emerald gown swayed wildly with every furious stride, and the pleasant smile she'd worn all evening had completely disappeared. By the time they reached us, every person in the ballroom knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Dion stopped just a few inches away from Sophie. Anyone watching from a distance might have mistaken him for a composed businessman confronting an unwelcome guest. Up close, the illusion completely fell apart. The muscles in his jaw twitched uncontrollably. The veins along his neck bulged beneath the crisp collar of his expensive shirt. His breathing had become shallow, almost frantic, and despite every effort to maintain control, raw panic burned in his eyes. He lowered his voice, desperately trying to preserve the polished executive image he had spent years creating. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed through clenched teeth. "This is a private event." His gaze darted nervously toward the guests gathering behind him. "You weren't invited." He leaned even closer. "You're embarrassing yourself, Sophie." His expression hardened. "Turn around. Walk back through those doors. Right now." Before she could answer, Brenda stepped forward, inserting herself between several curious guests who had begun drifting closer. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger inches from Sophie's face. "I cannot believe you actually had the nerve to come here," Brenda spat. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Several nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. Brenda wasn't speaking quietly anymore. She wanted an audience. "You've spent years dragging my son down. You refused to support him. You destroyed his peace. And now you've come here out of pure jealousy because you can't stand seeing him happy." Her voice grew louder with every sentence. "This evening is about celebrating his future. Not reliving your failures." She folded her arms confidently. "So do everyone a favor. Leave." The silence that followed was almost painful. Months earlier, even weeks earlier, those words would have devastated Sophie. She would have lowered her eyes, apologized, questioned herself, turned around, cried in the parking lot. That woman no longer existed. Everything Dion and Brenda had done to break her had accomplished the exact opposite. Instead of creating someone weak, they had forged someone unbreakable. Sophie didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at both of them with a calmness that was infinitely more terrifying than anger. Her shoulders remained perfectly straight. The sapphire necklace shimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers. When she finally spoke, her voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "I'm not leaving, Dion." No shouting, no trembling, just absolute certainty. "I actually came here for one reason." She smiled politely. "I'd like to offer a toast." Confused whispers immediately spread through the crowd. Dion blinked. "A toast?" For a brief moment, genuine confusion interrupted his anger. Before he could react, Sophie calmly stepped around him. "I moved with her, placing myself just close enough to prevent anyone from interfering. She walked directly toward the center of the ballroom, where nearly every guest could see her clearly. Ashley remained frozen beside the enormous ice sculpture. Moments earlier, she had looked like the glamorous bride-to-be. Now she looked like someone realizing the floor beneath her feet might disappear at any second. Sophie stopped near the center of the room. She slowly turned to face the crowd. Every conversation had died. Every phone had quietly appeared beneath the tables. People weren't just watching anymore. They were recording. Perfect. Sophie raised her left hand into the air. Her bare ring finger caught everyone's attention immediately. No wedding ring, no engagement ring, nothing. She waited until every eye in the ballroom settled on her hand. Then she began. "Tonight you've listened to Dion talk about success." Her voice echoed clearly across the ballroom. "You've heard stories about his thriving consulting company." She looked around slowly, making eye contact with table after table. "You've admired his expensive suits, his luxury lifestyle, his beautiful future." She paused. "But before you raise another glass, you deserve to know who you're actually celebrating." A ripple of murmurs moved across the room. Dion's face visibly tightened. Exactly as planned. "1 year ago," Sophie continued, "my husband came to me in tears. He told me his business was collapsing. He said one final investment would save everything. He claimed we would lose our home unless I helped him." Her eyes never left the crowd. "I believed him. I trusted my husband. I loved him. So when he begged me to let him pawn my custom platinum wedding ring, I said yes." Several women instinctively touched the rings on their own fingers. "He promised it would only be for 1 month. He promised the money would be returned. He promised he'd buy my ring back the moment his deal closed." She gave a slow, bitter smile. He never did. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning system sounded deafening. A banker standing near the stage quietly lowered his champagne glass. Another guest frowned. Someone whispered, "Did she say wedding ring?" Dion suddenly lunged forward. "Sophie." His voice cracked. "That's enough." He reached toward her arm. I stepped directly into his path. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough. Our eyes met. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I simply looked at him with the same calm expression I'd worn during military interrogations. His hand froze in midair. For several long seconds. Neither of us moved. Then, he slowly lowered it. He knew exactly what he saw in my eyes. Not emotion, not hesitation. Only certainty. Satisfied that he wouldn't try again, Sophie continued. "He never redeemed my ring." Her voice remained steady. "He took the money from the symbol of our marriage and used it to finance his secret relationship." Now she slowly turned toward Ashley. The younger woman's face had become completely colorless. But that's not even the funniest part. A faint smile appeared. The truly tragic part is that Dion was too broke to buy a real engagement ring. Ashley instinctively stared down at the enormous diamond sparkling on her finger. Sophie looked directly into her eyes. The pity in her expression hurt far more than hatred ever could. "Ashley," she said softly, "I'd strongly recommend taking that ring to a jeweler." Ashley blinked. "What?" "The engagement ring you're wearing." Sophie paused just long enough for every person in the ballroom to lean forward. "Isn't a diamond." The room collectively stopped breathing. "It is nothing more than a very expensive-looking piece of cubic zirconia." Gasps erupted across the ballroom. "He bought it using money from my wedding ring. And even then, he still couldn't afford the real thing." Ashley stared at the glittering stone on her finger as though she'd never seen it before. "No," she whispered. "No." Her breathing quickened. No. Then came the scream. A sharp, horrified cry echoed through the ballroom as she yanked her hand toward her face, examining the stone with desperate disbelief. Nearby guests instinctively stepped away from her. Several businessmen slowly looked toward Dion. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. The questions had already begun forming in their minds. If he'd lied about something this obvious, what else had he lied about? One revelation had done what years of deception could not. The image of the untouchable millionaire had developed its first visible crack, and everyone in the ballroom had just watched it happen with their own eyes. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. The silence hanging over the ballroom felt heavier than any argument ever could. Dozens of wealthy executives, attorneys, investors, and longtime country club members stared at Dion with expressions that were rapidly shifting from curiosity to suspicion. His carefully manufactured image had suffered its first crack. Everyone in the room had heard it. Everyone had seen Ashley's horrified reaction, and everyone was beginning to ask the same question. What if Sophie was telling the truth? Dion could almost hear the whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. His breathing became uneven. Sweat collected beneath the collar of his tailored suit despite the cool temperature inside the ballroom. For years he had controlled every conversation. Tonight, he couldn't control a single one. Ashley's trembling hands clutched the oversized engagement ring as though staring at it long enough might somehow transform imitation into reality. No, she whispered again. This can't be happening. She looked desperately toward Dion. Tell her she's lying. He didn't answer. Aren't you going to say something? Still nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Ashley slowly lowered her hand. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to betrayal. Around them, conversations erupted in hushed voices. I knew something about him never felt right. Didn't he just buy a new Range Rover? I thought his company landed some huge government contract. My husband invested with him last spring. You think any of that money was real? The rumors spread faster than Dion could possibly contain them. Every whispered sentence weakened him a little more. Every suspicious glance chipped away at the empire he'd spent years constructing. His greatest fear wasn't losing money. It wasn't prison. It wasn't even exposure. It was losing admiration. And admiration was evaporating by the second. Finally, Dion exploded. Shut up! His scream echoed violently through the ballroom. Every conversation stopped. He spun toward Sophie, his face twisted into something almost unrecognizable. The polished executive had disappeared completely. Standing before everyone now was a furious man barely capable of controlling himself. You've lost your mind, he shouted. She's mentally unstable. He pointed wildly toward the guests. Every single word she's saying is a lie. He looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for allies. You all know me. You've done business with me. You've been in my home. You know exactly who I am. But something had changed. Nobody rushed to defend him. Nobody laughed. Nobody nodded. Instead, people simply watched. Several businessmen quietly took another step away from him. One elderly couple exchanged nervous glances before moving toward the back of the ballroom. Even guests who had been congratulating him only minutes earlier suddenly seemed uncomfortable standing too close. The invisible circle around Dion began growing larger. He noticed, and panic tightened its grip. Brenda immediately rushed to his side. Don't listen to her, she shouted. She's bitter. She's jealous. She couldn't stand watching my son build a successful life without her. She pointed toward Sophie with shaking hands. Everything she's saying is nothing but revenge. Then she looked directly at the crowd. My son built his company from absolutely nothing. He worked day and night. He earned every single dollar. Her voice cracked. Don't let this woman destroy everything he's accomplished. No one answered. The silence was devastating. For the first time in years, Brenda realized her words no longer carried any authority. People weren't listening. They were observing, evaluating, questioning. Exactly what she had spent years preventing. Sophie remained perfectly calm. She waited until Brenda finished speaking. Then she took one slow step forward. If Dion truly earned everything honestly, she asked quietly, then perhaps he won't mind answering one very simple question. Dion swallowed. What question? She looked directly into his eyes. The $20,000 you paid to reserve this ballroom. Her voice remained perfectly even. Where did it come from? He froze. Not for a second. Not for two. Long enough for everyone to notice. You own a successful consulting company, Sophie continued. So answering should be easy. She tilted her head slightly. Which client paid the invoice? Dion opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He hesitated. My accountant. Another pause. Handles all of that? A quiet laugh escaped somewhere near the back of the room. Not mocking. Awkward. Uncomfortable. One businessman folded his arms. That's strange. He spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. I own 3 companies. I know exactly where every large payment comes from. Several people nodded. Another guest added quietly. So do I. The pressure intensified. Dion looked around desperately. He had built an identity around pretending to be an elite businessman. Unfortunately for him, the room was full of actual businessmen, and they immediately recognized someone bluffing. Sophie's voice interrupted the growing tension. Would you like me to answer for you? His eyes snapped toward her. No. You paid that deposit using funds stolen through a fraudulent second mortgage. She took another step. The mortgage forged in my sister's name while she was deployed overseas. A wave of shocked gasps rolled across the ballroom. Someone quietly muttered, "Oh my God." Another guest instinctively reached for his phone. A woman whispered, "Did she say deployed?" Several military veterans attending the event exchanged dark looks. Their expressions hardened instantly. Fraud was one thing. Stealing from a deployed service member was something entirely different. The atmosphere shifted. Sympathy disappeared. Disgust replaced it. Dion realized it too late. He wasn't losing the room anymore. He had already lost it. His breathing became faster. His hands trembled visibly. His expensive watch suddenly felt far heavier than before. He loosened his tie. It didn't help. Nothing could. Because everyone was finally seeing the man behind the performance. Not a millionaire, not a visionary entrepreneur, not a respected executive. Just a frightened fraud desperately trying to keep his collapsing lies from burying him alive. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. The confidence drained from Dion's face so quickly it was almost visible. He stood motionless beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the very people he had spent years trying to impress. Every expensive suit in the room suddenly felt like a jury robe. Every pair of eyes had become a silent verdict waiting to be delivered. For the first time in his life, he wasn't controlling the conversation. He was trapped inside it. His mouth opened, but no explanation came. No clever excuse. No polished corporate speech. Nothing. The silence stretched just long enough for every guest to recognize it for what it truly was. Guilt. I watched him carefully. People often believe panic explodes all at once. It doesn't. It builds in layers. First comes denial, then confusion, then the desperate search for an escape that no longer exists. Dion had just reached that final stage. His eyes darted around the ballroom, searching for someone, anyone, who might interrupt the nightmare unfolding in front of him. No one moved. No one came to his rescue. The businessmen who had been laughing with him only minutes earlier quietly stepped farther away. One attorney folded his arms and studied Dion with growing suspicion. A local bank executive removed his glasses and looked toward Sophie with renewed interest. The balance of power had completely shifted. People were no longer evaluating whether Sophie was telling the truth. They were trying to determine how much of the truth they had already missed. Dion finally forced himself to speak. He cleared his throat. This is ridiculous. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. She's making all of this up because she's bitter. He pointed toward Sophie. My ex-wife has been obsessed with destroying me ever since I moved on. He attempted a laugh. It sounded hollow. Pathetic. If any of you actually believe this nonsense, he looked desperately around the room. Then you've all completely lost your minds. No one laughed. Not a single person. The silence hit him harder than any insult could have. Brenda immediately stepped beside him again, determined to salvage whatever remained of the evening. My son doesn't owe anyone an explanation, she declared. He built everything he has through hard work. She lifted her chin proudly. Some people simply can't stand watching successful people succeed. Her eyes settled on Sophie. That's what this is. Jealousy. Pure jealousy. I couldn't help smiling. Brenda still believed this was a family argument. She had absolutely no idea that the real presentation hadn't even begun. Sophie calmly folded her hands in front of her. You know, she said softly, there's something I've always found fascinating. Brenda frowned. What? You've spent years telling everyone how successful Dion's consulting business is. That's right. You've told neighbors, family, church friends, business associates. You've proudly called yourself his business partner. Brenda smiled confidently. I am. Sophie nodded slowly. I know. That single sentence caught Brenda completely off guard. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain. Sophie continued. So perhaps you can answer something. Brenda folded her arms. Ask. What exactly does Dion's consulting company consult on? The question seemed almost harmless. Brenda answered immediately. Business strategy. Sophie nodded. What kind of business strategy? A pause. Corporate? Brenda hesitated. Development. What corporations? Silence. What industries? Another pause. What major clients? Brenda blinked. She looked toward Dion. He avoided her eyes. Sophie smiled almost sympathetically. That's strange. You've called yourself his partner for years. You've attended networking events. You've celebrated record profits. You've bragged about million-dollar contracts. She tilted her head slightly. But you can't name a single client. Several guests looked at each other. Someone quietly muttered, Neither can he. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the ballroom. Not cruel laughter. Embarrassed laughter. The kind people make when they suddenly realize they've been fooled. Dion's face darkened. Enough. His voice came out louder this time. I've had enough. He pointed toward the ballroom entrance. Security. The word echoed through the room. I want these women removed immediately. This is private property. They're trespassing. They're disrupting my event. His voice rose with every sentence. Throw them out. Almost instantly, the heavy ballroom doors opened. 3 large security guards entered the room wearing matching black suits with discreet earpieces. Professional. Calm. Efficient. They immediately identified the disturbance. Their eyes locked onto Sophie and me. Without hesitation, they began walking toward us. Slow, purposeful, confident. Dion finally smiled again. Not because he felt safe, because he believed he had regained control. There. He folded his arms across his chest. This little performance is over. Brenda actually laughed. A short, triumphant laugh that echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. She looked directly at Sophie. I warned you. You should have stayed home. The lead security officer approached until only a few feet separated us. He maintained the calm professionalism expected from someone working at an exclusive country club. "Good evening, ladies. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask both of you to leave the premises." His tone remained respectful. "I'd appreciate your cooperation." I didn't move. Neither did Sophie. The guard extended one hand politely. "If you'll come with me." I slowly reached toward my evening clutch. The movement immediately caught his attention. So did everyone else's. Guests leaned forward. Some expected pepper spray. Others probably imagined I was reaching for a phone. Instead, I calmly removed a black leather credential wallet. I opened it with one smooth motion. The gold federal shield reflected brilliantly beneath the crystal chandeliers. Every security guard froze. Every conversation stopped. I held the credential steady at eye level. Then I spoke with the same measured authority I'd used throughout my career. "Stand down." My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I am Special Agent Natalie." I watched recognition spread across the lead guard's face before I had even finished introducing myself. "United States Army Criminal Investigation Division." His expression changed instantly. "My unit is conducting an active federal investigation." I looked directly into his eyes. "You are about to interfere with it." The ballroom became so quiet that even the distant hum of the ventilation system seemed impossibly loud. The lead guard stared at the badge, then back at me, then at the badge again. His posture changed immediately. His extended hand dropped to his side. He took one respectful step backward, then another. Finally, he raised his arm, silently signaling the other two guards to stop. Within seconds, all three had backed away completely. The room erupted into stunned whispers, and across the ballroom, Dion's smile vanished for the second time that night. Dion stared at the security guards in complete disbelief. For several long seconds, he couldn't process what had just happened. Only moments earlier, they had been marching toward us with absolute confidence. Now they stood several feet away, rigid and silent, refusing to make another move. His entire plan had collapsed before his eyes. "What are you doing?" he barked. His voice echoed through the ballroom. "I told you to remove them." None of the guards answered. The lead officer kept his eyes on my federal credentials, fully aware of the consequences of interfering with an active investigation. Dion's expression twisted into disbelief. "I am the client," he shouted. "I paid for this event. You work for me?" The lead guard finally spoke. His voice remained calm and professional. "Sir, I'm afraid this situation has changed." "What does that even mean?" Dion snapped. "It means," the guard replied carefully, "that if this is a federal investigation, we are legally obligated not to interfere." The words landed like a hammer. A fresh wave of whispers swept through the ballroom. Several guests instinctively reached for their phones. Others quietly backed away from the stage. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the center of a possible federal case. Dion looked around frantically. He could actually see people distancing themselves from him. The isolation was becoming physical. His carefully cultivated inner circle was dissolving in real time. He forced an ugly laugh. "Federal investigation?" He pointed directly at me. "Come on. You people can't seriously believe this." He shook his head dramatically. "She's military police. She hands out parking tickets on base. This is nothing more than intimidation." He looked toward the crowd again. "We're civilians. This is private property. She has absolutely no jurisdiction here." His confidence sounded rehearsed, artificial. He wasn't speaking because he believed it. He was speaking because he desperately needed everyone else to. Unfortunately, the audience contained more than a few experienced attorneys, executives, and retired military officers. They knew the difference. An older gentleman wearing a navy blazer quietly whispered to the woman beside him, If she's carrying CID credentials, this is serious. Another guest nodded. Very serious. Across the room, a corporate compliance officer folded his arms. If federal investigators are here, he murmured, I'm leaving before my name ends up anywhere near this. Within seconds, several executives quietly began moving toward the outer edges of the ballroom. The empty space surrounding Dion grew even larger. He saw it happen. Panic flashed across his face. Brenda, however, refused to surrender. She marched toward the security guards, pointing an accusing finger. Have you all lost your minds? She shrieked. She's lying. She's pretending to be some kind of federal agent. If you don't throw her out immediately, I'll sue this country club into bankruptcy. The lead guard barely looked at her. His attention never left me. I'm sorry, ma'am. His tone remained respectful. But we will not interfere. Brenda's mouth fell open. You. She struggled to find words. You work here. Yes, ma'am. And you're refusing to remove them? Yes, ma'am. She looked as though someone had physically slapped her. Years of intimidation, years of getting exactly what she wanted, years of bullying everyone around her. None of it mattered anymore. Authority had entered the room. Real authority, not the kind created by expensive clothes or country club memberships, the kind backed by federal law. I calmly closed my credential wallet and slipped it back into my evening clutch. Then I looked directly at Dion. You've always had a remarkable talent. My voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. For speaking with absolute confidence about subjects you clearly don't understand. His jaw tightened. I never claimed to be military police. I took one slow step toward the stage. My jurisdiction has nothing to do with traffic violations. Another step. My unit investigates complex financial crimes. Another. Government procurement fraud. Wire fraud. Identity theft. Forgery. Financial exploitation involving federal assets. Each sentence landed harder than the last. The room had become completely silent again. I continued walking. Every guest instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the center of the ballroom. No one wanted to stand between a federal investigator and her suspect. Dion noticed. His breathing became noticeably heavier. He took one involuntary step backward, then another. The confidence that had carried him through the evening was disappearing with astonishing speed. I stopped at the bottom of the stage. He remained above me. Barely. You've spent years believing appearances matter more than facts. I looked up at him. You assumed nobody would ever read the paperwork. You assumed expensive suits would distract people from forged signatures. You assumed luxury cars would make stolen money look legitimate. His lips parted slightly. Still no words. You believed that while I was serving overseas, I continued, you could quietly forge legal documents in my name. Steal $250,000. Launder those funds through shell accounts. And use the proceeds to finance this entire fantasy. Several guests gasped. One banker quietly removed his wedding ring and slipped it into his pocket without realizing he was doing it, a nervous habit. A retired judge standing near the back slowly shook his head. This, he whispered, is getting much worse. I climbed the first step onto the stage. The distance between us became even smaller. Dion instinctively retreated again. He nearly stumbled over the microphone cable lying across the polished wood. You thought nobody would ever notice. I took another step. You thought no one would compare signatures. Another. You thought military deployment records wouldn't exist. Another. You thought digital banking records disappeared. Another. You thought electronic wire transfers couldn't be traced. His breathing had become almost frantic now. Tiny beads of sweat rolled down his temples. His expensive suit suddenly looked several sizes too small. You made one fatal mistake. I stopped only a few feet away. You underestimated how patient federal investigations can be. The words seemed to suck every remaining ounce of confidence from his body. For the first time that night, Dion looked like a man who finally understood that this wasn't a family dispute. It wasn't a public argument. It wasn't revenge. It was the beginning of the end. And somewhere beyond the closed ballroom doors, that ending was already walking toward him. For one long, suffocating moment, the ballroom stood perfectly still. No one spoke. No one dared move. The silence itself felt oppressive, hanging over the room like the calm before a violent storm. Dion stood frozen on the stage, breathing heavily as sweat trickled down the sides of his face. Every instinct told him to run, but his pride refused to let him. He was still trying to convince himself he could talk his way out of this. He had always talked his way out of everything. This time would be different. Before another word could be spoken, the massive oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom exploded open. The thunderous impact echoed through the country club, drowning out the nervous whispers. Every head snapped toward the entrance. 6 federal agents entered in perfect formation. They weren't wearing tuxedos. They weren't dressed for a celebration. Dark tactical jackets stretched across their shoulders, each one marked with bold yellow lettering that immediately commanded attention. Their heavy boots struck the polished hardwood floor in synchronized rhythm, each measured step announcing the end of Dion's carefully constructed fantasy. The atmosphere inside the ballroom transformed instantly. Only seconds earlier, it had resembled an elegant engagement celebration. Now, it looked like an active federal crime scene. Guests scattered instinctively. Expensive chairs scraped violently across the floor. Crystal glasses tipped over. Champagne spilled across white tablecloths as wealthy socialites hurried away from the center of the room. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near the man federal agents had apparently come to meet. Several businessmen abandoned their drinks entirely. One local politician quietly slipped his wedding ring into his pocket before stepping toward the back wall, as though somehow making himself less visible. The jazz quartet stopped playing altogether. One violinist still held his bow suspended in the air, unable to look away from what was unfolding. Every conversation had disappeared. Only the rhythmic footsteps of the agents remained. Dion stared in horror. "No," he whispered. "No." The word barely escaped his lips. His eyes darted from one jacket to another, then toward me, then back again. The impossible had become reality. They weren't here by coincidence. They were here for him. Brenda's confident smile evaporated instantly. The champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spraying expensive champagne across the hem of her emerald gown. She didn't even notice. Her entire body had begun shaking. "This," she whispered. "This can't be happening." Ashley looked even worse. Only minutes earlier she had imagined herself becoming the wife of a wealthy executive. Now she found herself standing in the middle of a federal operation. Her breathing became rapid. Panic flashed across her face. Without saying a word to anyone, she quietly removed her high heels. She glanced toward a side hallway leading to the catering kitchens. Then she ran. She had made it only a few steps before one of the FBI agents calmly stepped into her path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch her. He simply blocked the doorway. "I'm afraid no one is leaving." His tone remained perfectly professional. "Please return to the ballroom." Ashley's face turned ghostly white. She slowly backed away. There was nowhere left to run. The perimeter had already been secured. Meanwhile, the lead FBI agent continued walking toward the stage with measured confidence. The remaining agents spread smoothly throughout the ballroom, positioning themselves near exits and key access points with practiced precision. Years of training showed in every movement. Nobody had to shout. Nobody had to panic. Control had already been established. The guests sensed it immediately. Dion, however, refused to accept reality. He stumbled backward and grabbed the microphone stand as though it might somehow keep him upright. "This is insane," he shouted. "There has to be some mistake." His voice cracked badly. "I haven't done anything." The words echoed across the ballroom. No one believed them. The lead FBI agent stopped a few feet from the stage. His expression remained calm, unreadable, professional. He looked toward me. I gave a nearly invisible nod. Everything had unfolded exactly as planned. Months of investigation, thousands of financial records, digital forensics, bank documents, witness interviews, electronic surveillance. Every piece had led to this exact moment. The agent shifted his attention back to Dion. "Mr. Washington." His deep voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "I strongly advise you not to make any sudden movements." The words landed with devastating weight. Several guests instinctively looked away. Others quietly pulled out their phones, recording history as it unfolded. Dion's breathing became almost uncontrollable. His expensive suit clung to his back with sweat. He looked toward the crowd, toward the businessmen who had once admired him, toward the politicians who had eagerly accepted his invitations, toward the neighbors who had envied his lifestyle. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one offered support. Not one spoke his name. The room that had gathered to celebrate his success had become an audience waiting to watch his downfall. He was completely alone. I slowly walked onto the stage until I stood beside the lead agent. Then I turned toward the guests. They deserved to understand exactly why this celebration had become a federal operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began calmly, "many of you believed you were doing business with a successful entrepreneur." I looked around the room. "You believed Mr. Washington owned a thriving consulting firm." Another pause. "You believed the luxury cars parked outside belonged to him." "You believed this party was financed by legitimate business profits." I shook my head. "None of that is true." The words rippled through the ballroom. "Dion Washington has no successful consulting empire. He has no profitable corporate enterprise. What he built instead," I looked directly at Dion, "was a sophisticated financial fraud." His shoulders visibly collapsed. I continued. "While I was deployed overseas serving this country, he forged legal documents using my identity. He fraudulently obtained a second mortgage worth $250,000. He laundered those funds through shell business accounts. He used stolen federal money to manufacture the illusion of extraordinary wealth." I slowly gestured around the magnificent ballroom. The chandeliers, the catering, the imported champagne, the luxury vehicles outside, the designer clothing, the engagement ring, even this celebration. I paused. It was all paid for with stolen money. A collective gasp swept across the room. One elderly banker quietly removed the champagne glass from his lips and placed it on a nearby table without taking another sip. Suddenly, no one wanted anything Dion had paid for. No one reached for another drink. No one returned to their seat. The celebration had ceased to exist. Only minutes earlier, the ballroom had echoed with laughter, clinking crystal glasses, and confident conversations about business deals and bright futures. Now it felt more like a courtroom. The crystal chandeliers still bathed the room in warm golden light, but somehow everything looked colder, sharper. Every guest stood motionless, eyes fixed on the stage. The lead FBI agent took one measured step forward. He opened a thick black evidence portfolio. Inside were neatly organized documents sealed in transparent protective sleeves. Years of lies, reduced to paper. He removed the first file. "Mr. Washington," he said evenly, "our investigation has confirmed multiple forged mortgage applications submitted under the identity of a deployed service member." Another document followed. "Wire transfers through shell corporations." Another. "Fraudulent banking records." Another. Identity theft. Another. Federal financial fraud. Each page landed against the podium with a crisp, unmistakable sound. Every sheet felt like another nail sealing Dion's fate. The guests watched in stunned silence. This wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't an angry ex-wife making accusations. It wasn't family drama. It was evidence. Verified. Documented. Federal. Dion stared at the growing stack of files as if refusing to believe they actually existed. His lips moved silently. No words came out. Brenda suddenly lunged toward the podium. "Those papers are fake!" she screamed. "They're fabricated!" She pointed wildly at Sophie. "She planned this. She manipulated everyone." The lead agent calmly turned toward her. "Mrs. Washington." His voice never rose. "I strongly advise you to remain where you are." "I don't have to listen to you," she shouted. "You can't tell me what to do." She took another aggressive step forward. One FBI agent immediately intercepted her. Not violently. Simply placing himself between Brenda and the evidence. "Ma'am, I need you to stop." Brenda tried to push past him. "Move." She shoved his shoulder. The ballroom gasped. The agent didn't react emotionally. He simply looked at her with practiced professionalism. "Ma'am," he repeated. "That was a mistake." She froze. Only then did she realize what she had just done. Assaulting a federal agent in front of nearly 200 witnesses. Several phones captured the entire exchange from different angles. The lead agent gave a subtle nod. Another agent stepped beside Brenda. "Mrs. Washington," he said calmly, "please place your hands behind your back." Her eyes widened. "What?" "You are being detained for interfering with an active federal investigation and for assaulting a federal officer." For a heartbeat, she simply stared. Then panic erupted. "No!" She spun toward the guests. "Tell them!" She pointed frantically around the ballroom. "Someone tell them this is ridiculous." No one moved. She looked toward longtime neighbors, toward women she'd lunched with for years, toward business associates, toward distant relatives. Every face looked away. No one wanted to become part of this. Her confidence crumbled. "You can't arrest me," she whispered. "I'm his mother." No one answered. The soft metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the ballroom. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Brenda looked down at the steel cuffs around her wrists. For the first time in years, she had absolutely no control. Across the stage, Dion watched in horror. His mother, the woman who had defended every lie, covered every theft, bullied every victim, protected every fraud, was now standing in handcuffs before everyone she had spent years trying to impress. His knees nearly buckled. Ashley burst into tears. Real tears this time. Not dramatic. Not calculated. Pure panic. She slowly removed the engagement ring from her finger. She stared at it for several seconds. Then, without a word, she walked toward Dion. Every guest watched. She stopped directly in front of him. Her hand trembled. "I gave up everything," she whispered. "My apartment. My job. My reputation. My family. I believed you." A tear rolled down her cheek. "You told me we were building a future." She looked at the ring one last time, then dropped it. The fake diamond struck the hardwood floor with a tiny, hollow click. No one bent down to pick it up. Ashley shook her head slowly. "I was never your fiancé." Her voice broke. "I was just another victim." She turned around. This time, none of the agents stopped her. She wasn't fleeing. She was leaving him. Completely. She walked through the silent ballroom alone. Guests instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. No one spoke. No one comforted her. Within seconds, the heavy ballroom doors closed behind her. Dion didn't call after her. He couldn't. Everything he'd built was collapsing too quickly. His mother was in handcuffs. His fiancée had abandoned him. His business partners were quietly slipping out side exits. His investors were deleting his phone number before they even reached the parking lot. His reputation, his fortune, his future. All of it was disappearing in real time, and he still hadn't heard the words he feared most. The lead FBI agent closed the evidence portfolio. Then he looked directly at Dion. His expression never changed. "Mr. Washington," he said calmly, "I believe it's time we discussed your future." For the first time that evening, Dion understood there might not be one. Dion stood motionless. His shoulders had slumped. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts. The confident executive who had welcomed guests less than an hour earlier no longer existed. Only a frightened man remained. He looked around the ballroom one final time, desperately searching for a familiar face. Someone to defend him. Someone to question the investigation. Someone to remind everyone of the image he had spent years creating. There was no one. Not a single ally remained. The businessmen who once admired him now avoided eye contact. Neighbors whispered quietly among themselves. Several investors had already slipped out of the ballroom, their phones pressed to their ears as they urgently contacted attorneys and financial advisors. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. Success attracts people. Scandal sends them running. The lead FBI agent took another deliberate step toward the stage. He removed a folded document from the evidence folder. His tone remained calm, almost conversational. "Mr. Dion Washington." Dion slowly raised his head. "You are under federal arrest." The words echoed through the ballroom with crushing finality. For conspiracy to commit wire fraud. For aggravated identity theft. For mortgage fraud. For bank fraud. For laundering proceeds obtained through fraudulent financial transactions. For forging federal financial documents. And for knowingly exploiting the legal protections afforded to an active duty deployed service member. Each charge struck harder than the one before it. Guests exchanged stunned looks. Even those who knew little about federal law understood one thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. These were life-changing charges. The agent continued. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you." Ironically, for the first time in years, that final sentence was becoming relevant. Dion's lips trembled. He looked toward me, then toward Sophie. Finally, he laughed. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't arrogance. It was the hollow, broken laugh of someone whose reality had collapsed beyond repair. "This," he whispered, "is because of you." His eyes settled on Sophie. "I gave you everything." His voice cracked. "I built your life. I made you who you are." Sophie looked at him quietly. There was no anger left in her expression, only peace. "You didn't build my life." Her voice was gentle. "You spent years trying to destroy it." She took one slow step closer. "The difference is, you failed." Those two words landed harder than every piece of evidence presented that evening. Dion lowered his head. The fight disappeared from his eyes. The agents approached without urgency. There was no resistance, no dramatic struggle, no desperate escape. He simply stood there, defeated. One agent carefully guided his hands behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. This time, no one gasped. Everyone expected it. The sound merely confirmed what had already become inevitable. One of the photographers attending the gala instinctively lifted his camera. The shutter clicked. Then another. Then another. The image that would spread across local news by morning wasn't of an engagement celebration. It was of a wealthy fraud standing in handcuffs beneath crystal chandeliers. His luxury lifestyle had ended exactly where he had hoped to celebrate it. As the agents escorted him down the steps, Dion suddenly stopped walking. He turned toward the guests one final time. "They're lying," he shouted desperately. "I'll beat every one of these charges. No jury will believe this." His voice echoed through the ballroom. No one answered. Not a single person. One by one. Guests quietly looked away. Some out of disappointment, some out of embarrassment, some because they suddenly realized they had ignored warning signs for years. Being ignored proved far more painful than being hated. The agents resumed walking. This time, Dion didn't resist. As they reached the ballroom doors, another man hurried inside wearing a dark business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself to the lead agent before approaching several stunned guests. "Good evening. My name is Richard Collins. I'm the court-appointed receiver." A fresh ripple of confusion spread through the room. He continued calmly. "Effective immediately, every corporate asset owned by Washington Strategic Consulting has been frozen under federal court authority." Several businessmen stopped in their tracks. "The company?" one asked. Collins nodded. "The business accounts. The company vehicles. The investment portfolios. The office equipment. The real estate holdings. The luxury automobiles. The pending contracts. Everything has been seized pending forfeiture proceedings." Another guest frowned. "What about his house?" Collins glanced down at his paperwork. "The residence has already been secured. The property is subject to forfeiture. The same applies to all financial assets purchased using proceeds of the alleged fraud." A stunned silence followed. People suddenly understood what those words actually meant. Dion wasn't merely being arrested. He wasn't simply losing a lawsuit. His entire life, every symbol of success, every expensive possession, every illusion of wealth, was disappearing overnight. The empire hadn't cracked. It had ceased to exist. As the ballroom doors opened once more, the agents escorted Dion into the cold evening air. Camera flashes immediately erupted outside. Reporters had arrived. Someone must have alerted the media the moment federal vehicles appeared at the country club. Questions were shouted from every direction. "Mr. Washington, did you steal military funds? Do you deny the fraud allegations? Were your businesses fake?" He kept walking, head lowered, silent. For years he had chased attention. Tonight, he finally had all of it. Just not the kind he had imagined. 3 months later. The federal courthouse looked nothing like the glittering ballroom where Dion's empire had collapsed. There were no crystal chandeliers, no champagne, no expensive music. Only polished wooden benches, quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of justice moving exactly as it should. This time, there was no audience gathered to celebrate him. Only people waiting to watch accountability finally arrive. Sophie sat beside me in the second row. She looked completely different from the woman I had first reunited with after returning from deployment. The fear was gone. So was the uncertainty. She no longer looked like someone waiting for permission to reclaim her life. She had already done it. Across the courtroom, Dion entered wearing a plain orange detention uniform. Without the tailored suits, without the luxury watch, without perfectly styled hair, without expensive shoes. He looked almost unrecognizable. For years, designer labels had hidden the truth. Now there was nowhere left to hide. Brenda entered moments later under the supervision of U.S. Marshals. She had aged dramatically in only a few months. The confidence that once filled every room she entered had disappeared entirely. She no longer barked orders. She no longer interrupted everyone around her. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The judge entered. Everyone stood. After the formalities, the courtroom settled into complete silence. the prosecutor rose first. For nearly 2 hours, he carefully reconstructed the fraud from beginning to end. Every forged signature, every fabricated mortgage document, every fraudulent wire transfer, every shell corporation, every hidden account, every stolen dollar. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank executives testified. Federal forensic accountants explained how the money had been traced across dozens of transactions. Digital analysts demonstrated how electronic signatures had been manipulated. Mortgage specialists confirmed that the loan application had been built on forged documents. Then, I testified. I described my deployment overseas, the legal protections granted to active duty military personnel, the moment I discovered the fraudulent mortgage, the investigation that followed. Every answer remained calm, factual, professional. When I stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained completely silent. Then Sophie testified. Unlike me, she didn't discuss banking records. She talked about trust, about marriage, about believing promises, about handing over her wedding ring because she genuinely believed she was helping the man she loved save their future. She described waiting month after month for him to redeem it. She described realizing the money had instead funded another relationship. There wasn't a dramatic outburst. There didn't need to be. The truth carried enough weight on its own. Several jurors quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Even the court reporter paused for a brief moment before continuing to type. When the defense finally presented its case, there wasn't much left to defend. Dion's attorney argued that bookkeeping mistakes had spiraled out of control, that paperwork had been misunderstood, that financial pressure had caused poor decisions. But documents don't misunderstand themselves. Digital records don't accidentally forge signatures. Wire transfers don't move hundreds of thousands of dollars by mistake. Facts remained facts. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Every person in the courtroom stood. The foreperson unfolded the verdict sheet. We, the jury, he began, find the defendant guilty. The first count. Guilty. The second. Guilty. The third. Guilty. Again, and again, and again. Every major federal charge ended exactly the same way. Guilty. By the time the final verdict had been read, the courtroom already knew the sentence would change the rest of Dion's life. Several weeks later, sentencing took place. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He discussed greed, abuse of trust, the deliberate exploitation of legal protections designed for deployed military personnel, the impact financial crimes have on victims long after the money disappears. Finally, he looked directly at Dion. This court finds that your actions were not impulsive. They were calculated. They were sustained. And they were motivated entirely by personal gain. He paused. You stole not because you were desperate. You stole because you believed you would never be held accountable. The judge adjusted his glasses. You were wrong. The sentence was substantial. Years in federal prison, full financial restitution, permanent forfeiture of fraudulently obtained assets. Additional civil judgments followed soon afterward. Every luxury vehicle was auctioned. The country house was sold. Investment accounts disappeared. Corporate entities were dissolved. Even the artwork hanging in his office became evidence before eventually being liquidated. By the end of the year, almost nothing remained of the empire he had spent years pretending to build. Ashley testified during the financial hearings. She cooperated fully with investigators. Evidence confirmed she had known very little about the larger fraud. After returning several luxury items purchased with stolen funds, she avoided criminal prosecution. She quietly left the state shortly afterward. No interviews, no social media, no public statements. She simply disappeared from the life Dion had promised her. Brenda accepted a plea agreement after overwhelming evidence established her role in concealing financial records and obstructing investigators. She received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. When asked during the hearing whether she regretted her actions, she remained silent. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had finally run out of excuses. As for Sophie, her recovery wasn't measured in money. The restitution helped. The fraudulent mortgage was completely removed. Her financial record was restored. Insurance proceeds and federal compensation covered the remaining losses. But healing came from something far more valuable: freedom. Months later, she opened a small nonprofit organization dedicated to